This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Four minutes after 10 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Quite a lot to get through today. Some very odd goings on at the Jewish Chronicle that everybody concerned about the unfolding situations in the Middle East should be deeply perturbed by. We'll have a proper look at that a little later in the programme. I'm drawn also to a lovely story about the importance of public speaking, particularly in state schools, and the difference that it might make. I want to know whether or not that is a perspective that is held only from a position of privilege. And for once, I can wear my privilege proudly on this one as a former national schools public speaking. Have I ever mentioned that to you before? Have I ever let that slip? Have I ever accidentally allowed that little nugget of pertinent personal information to slip into our mornings together? Yes, national schools public speaking champion. Don't you know? So I am very much on one side of that argument, and I'm not 100% sure that that side is 100% correct. Some people hate it. Some people go cold at the very thought of standing up in front of a room full of people, and I'm not quite sure that forcing them or even encouraging them to do so would be entirely beneficial. And the young woman who was photographed at one of the ceasefire rallies in London holding up a placard which depicted a coconut tree upon which a couple of conservative politicians of colour dangled in the guise of coconuts was acquitted in court on Friday of pretty grave offences. Should she ever have been in court? And what exactly is the rubric is probably a good word to use. The twists and turns, if you like, of that epithet, that insult. It's certainly not one I would ever direct at a person of colour because I'm white. But what is the landscape of a person of colour calling another person of colour a coconut? Oddly, I've got quite a lot to say about that. But I'm also conscious of not really being entitled to say some of the stuff that I might privately think. So it will be over to you, I suspect, at 11 o'clock. But we begin with this story. We talked on a couple of days last week about front pageophobia, about the fact that Starmer, as is probably best evinced at the moment with the winter fuel payment policy, is not going to govern by front page. He certainly is not frightened of the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail in many ways are sort of abnegating their role as a critic of government because they've got Boris Johnson on the payroll. I don't know if you remember the stories of Boris Johnson's wallpaper, the 7,000 pounds that had to be paid even just to cover it up. I don't know if you even knew that story. While he was Prime Minister, another £7,000 worth of taxpayers' cash was spent on painting over the infamous gold wallpaper that got into trouble for buying in the first place. But he also saw the resignation of his own ethics advisors over his attempts to cover up and claim that he'd forgotten who paid for the debt. So, the scandal, on a scale of 1 to 10, the scandal of Boris Johnson's home decor would be an 8, and the scandal of Keir Starmer's wife's wardrobe would be a 1 or a 2. But it's still on the scale. And absolutely essential that nobody pretends otherwise. It's still on the scale. The Daily Mail, with which I have a peculiar obsession because of the damage done to our country by its editor-in-chief Paul Dacre and his attacks upon everything from the independence of our judiciary to academic freedom to parliamentary democracy, all of the great British values of our time under repeated and sustained attack from the man that used to edit that newspaper. That's where my peculiar obsession comes from. They have him on the payroll. They have Johnson on the payroll, the man who rode roughshod over every constitutional norm in this country, tried to rewrite the rules of parliamentary ethics after one of his allies, Owen Paterson, was found to have smashed them to smithereens in pursuit of personal profit, and who, of course, ran away from Parliament rather than actually be held accountable for his own actions in lying repeatedly to them, denied his constituents in Uxbridge the right of demanding a recall. He legged it, he hid, he dug a big hole and buried himself in it before any of those democratic norms could be enacted, and Paul Dacre responded by rewarding him with an enormous column in the Daily Mail. A case of quid pro quo, if you like, because, of course, Boris Johnson was keen to install Paul Dacre as, I kid you not, the chair of Ofcom. the organisation that has oversight of all broadcasters in the country, up to and including me. So that was what Boris Johnson thought the media should look like, and what Paul Dacre thought the government should look like involved a man who lied as if it was going out of fashion, who filled his pockets, or at least his home, with gifts from all manner of tycoons, tried to keep it secret, and then claimed that he'd forgotten where all the money came from every time he walked into the flat where the fruits of his donors' largesse were literally painted all over the walls, plastered all over the walls. So that would be an 8. But it doesn't stop, and this is the point, it doesn't stop the Daily Mail pretending that Keir Starmer is the new John Profumo. It doesn't stop them pretending that he has engaged in behaviour at least as scandalous as, I've already said John Profumo. What else is up there with enormously scandalous political behaviour? And there it is. Why can't millionaire Starmers buy their own clothes? Front of the Times, a lot more sober. Starmer's wife had £5,000 worth of clothes paid for by donor. And that's just true. That is the facts. The rules, as they stand, are to do with conflict of interest. So they didn't believe... Let's get the facts out there first before we have a look at what's going on in Idiot's Corner. The facts of the matter are that this has only come to the attention of the authorities because the Starmers thought they didn't have to declare it, and then they were given advice that they did, at which point they came forward. That, to me, is the first mistake. I think because of the environment in which they find themselves, and it's not front-page-ophobia, this. It's not front-page-ophobia. This is the importance of putting clear blue water between themselves and the corruption that has gone before. The corruption particularly typified by Boris Johnson. I could stay on until long after Sheila's show has finished and not even come close to fully chronicling all of the corruptions, the mendacities and the disgraces of Boris Johnson's regime. But that doesn't matter. Neither does it matter that the Daily Mail puts Boris Johnson back in a position of prominence, literally rewards him for being the biggest liar in the history of our Prime Minister's office. None of that matters. Starmer has to be judged according to Starmer. It would be whataboutery to keep drawing the comparison. It's important to get it out there early, just to highlight the hypocrisy of people claiming that this is a particularly pungent scandal. But it is a big, for me at least, and we'll open up the phone line shortly, and you will be able to tell me why it isn't. This opens the door to a perception that they're all as bad as each other. And it's not a perception that is entirely unfair. So the footballification element of this conversation is pretty clear. Oh, do we know who paid for Johnson's holiday on that fancy desert island? Do we know? Did we ever find out who actually paid for that? You see what you see what I mean? No attempt to lie, but there was a failure to over-disclose, I would call it, and that opens the door to a perception among normal people like you and me. Well, you at least. I don't know how normal I am. To think that they're all as bad as each other. Why would you do this? These are all questions that we're going to ask in a minute. 0345 6060973 will be the number that you need. So I think this is a bigger mistake than some of Keir Starmer's allies would allow. I don't think it is a behavioural error or an ethical error. It's not a question of standards. It's a question of judgment. So here's what I would have done. I'd have over-declared. I would have told the authorities that my wife was in receipt of largesse from a party donor, even if I wasn't required to. To be honest with you, and I haven't consulted Mrs. O'Brien over this, and it's highly unlikely that I end up in politics, but I'm not sure I would have taken it in the first place. I mean, I am, sadly, at this stage in my life, almost preternaturally scruffy. I don't know why. I walk past mirrors sometimes and I think, who the hell dressed him? And then I remember it was me. I didn't used to be like this. I think, as I enter the midpoint of my 6th decade, I might start trying to pull my socks up, both metaphorically and literally. But I didn't used to be very scruffy. And there is a relationship between how good you look and money. When I interviewed Tony Blair the other week, I could tell you that his suit would be well into 4 figures. I can spot that from a mile off as a consequence of my days in menswear. And actually, the odder your shape, the odder your body shape, the more wise it is to spend as much money as you can possibly afford on good tailoring, if that's how you want to look. So I can talk the talk, I just struggle to walk the walk. I'm not an expert on women's clothes, but I assume some of these things hold equally true, particularly on alterations tailors, actually. I think that's an expense that if you are going to be judged by your appearance pretty heavily, and we know that partners of politicians, for good or for ill, female partners of male politicians are scrutinised extraordinarily, then a good alterations tailor will be worth their weight in metaphorical gold. But you have to tell people if you take something from anyone. I just don't understand how they've made this mistake. Even the defence of saying we didn't think we had to creates the possibility of it coming out later. I think, and I never know exactly what the angle I'm going to take on a program is until I start talking to you. I can think about something all weekend, but until I actually open my gob, I don't actually know exactly where my needle is going to end up pointing on the sort of Richter scale of concern or anger or upset or hilarity, depending on what the story is that we're discussing. And so quite often, the more I talk about something, as I try and explain the twists and turns of it to you, the more my own opinion crystallizes. And although we're not going to join in any of the ludicrous attempts to pretend that this is even on the same planet as the scandals which Boris Johnson was busted for, I think this is a bigger misstep than people like David Lammy have acknowledged over the course of the weekend while being interviewed. I think Yvette Cooper was doing the rounds this morning. I presume she was asked about it, but I didn't hear what she had to say. Female colleague said to me this morning, you don't know what it's like to be a woman, which I think we can all agree is true. I have no idea what it's like to be a woman. And the scrutiny to which you are exposed, the way in which Cherie Blair, for example, was written about and talked about was hideous at times. I think one Daily Mail columnist called her the Wicked Witch, which you have to presume was an allusion, at least in part, to what he considered her physical appearance to represent. I don't see it myself, but you know that these things are normal, and therefore the idea that Mrs. Starmer very suddenly has to cut a swathe, has to cut a look far superior or far more likely to be scrutinised than anything she's had to do before. And the key area here would be repetition. So you've got, 4 frocks? 4 go-to frocks, maybe 1 or 2 go-to frocks that you know you look the business in. And if you've got to go somewhere where you need to look the business, you'll wear that frock, or you'll wear one of 3 or 4 if you're lucky. And of course, for everybody else, that's normal. But for somebody like that, you wear the same dress twice, it's actually a news story. So these aren't excuses. These are explanations of why perhaps they needed more clothes, more high-end clothes, than they would ordinarily have been able to buy for themselves in the very short-term window available. But I'm not buying that either. I just think that if you are Keir Starmer, then your priorities outside of the political sphere, your PR priorities, are to persuade the British public that you are nothing like what has gone before. And this, I'm afraid, is a bar knocked off the hurdle. If this was a dressage competition, that's 4 faults. He's knocked that one down. He didn't have to do it, but he has. So I don't do phone-ins really about how big a deal you think a story is, but I do flirt with the question occasionally and giving you the scale of this being a 1 to a 2. Here is something that shouldn't have happened but did, and we brought it to the attention of the authorities. It's not anywhere near. Here is something that we desperately tried to hide from the authorities. We tried to cover up, and we lied about until we were blown sky high by our own ethics advisor resigning in protest at our inability to tell the truth. So you know and I know that that's chalk and cheese. But I still think this is a problem. I still think this is the problem. So David Lammy said yesterday, the truth is that successive prime ministers, unless you're a billionaire like the last one, do rely on political donations so they can look their best, both in the hope of representing the country, if you're in the opposition, or indeed as prime minister. So I am going to ask whether you care. What? No, I'm not. Well, yes, I am. I have now. 0345 6060973. But what do you? How big a misstep is this? How let down do you feel by Keir Starmer on the question of putting clear blue water between himself and the obvious corruption that went before. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. And if you know more about clothes than I do, which again is highly likely, if you know more about clothes than I do, how do we actually feel about the idea that our Prime Minister doesn't earn enough? Do you know how I got into? Good Lord, I completely missed the biggest opportunity ever for one of my most hackneyed and overused anecdotes. My entire journalistic career hinges upon a Prime Minister buying a suit. Did you know that? I would not be here today were it not for a Prime Minister buying a suit in the early 1990s, mid-1990s. That's absolutely extraordinary. And I'm 99% certain he paid for it himself. So what do we think about the broader question of donors buying clothes, glasses, outfits for Prime Ministers? I'm pretty confident it's a no-no. And I don't quite understand why Keir Starmer's done it. So that can be a question as well. I can't get excited about it, says Brian. I don't need you to get excited, Brian. I need you to get engaged. Should they be taking money? Ever. Or clothes, rather, from anybody else, from donors? And why do you think they've done this? 0345 6060 973. Knowing what we know about Keir Starmer, don't know much about his wife. Why have they done something that leaves them so obviously open to criticism? Hit the numbers now, you will get through.
James O'Brien on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It is 22 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Obviously, I am aware of the Prime Minister's meetings in Italy. I'm aware of the 8 humans that perished in the English Channel at the weekend. And in the hierarchy of what matters more and what is important, then obviously these stories matter more. But in terms of what engages or concerns us on the phone-in element of the programme, the rules are rather different. And I am inexorably drawn to Keir Starmer's stupid, there's a word I haven't used yet to describe him, stupid decision to accept clothes for his wife from a party donor and failure to disclose it because he thought he didn't have to. Anyway, enough of what I think. What do you think? Louise is in Chesterless Street. Louise, what would you like to say?
Oh, hiya, James.
Hello.
Sorry, I'm a little bit...
What?
Well, not nervous.
A little bit well? What's wrong with that?
I'm a bit...
What?
I'm angry.
Okay.
And depressed.
Oh, Lord. What, before you were listening to the show, or as a consequence of tuning in this morning?
As a consequence.
Oh,
I haven't.
Well,
we
won't be putting this one in the adverts, will we, Louise? Go on.
I haven't heard all of the details about this thing with Starmer and his clothes and glasses and what have you. I've just heard snippets, and I normally listen to the news all the time, and
Yes.
I've just had to switch off because I had so much hope when Labour got in.
Yes.
I felt relieved. I felt the grown-ups are in the room. Things are going to get better. This is a guy who doesn't care about gold-plated wallpaper or whatever it was,
Yes.
Johnson, and he doesn't party with, Lebedev, whatever his name is, in wherever it was in Italy and end up drunk on it. He doesn't do things in his office with his mistress. I thought, here we have a man of integrity. And I just thought, thank God. And I'm angry and I'm disappointed about this clothes thing. I don't know why it's got to me so much.
Nor do I.
But
let's try and work it out.
They're not short of a bob or two. What has he got swept along with the power? What is it? And to do this after cutting the fuel
payments
benefits
for pensioners,
for the pensioners, I just don't get it. I don't get it. And I hope he's listening. You're disappointing me, Keir. You've let me down. And that's it, really.
And well, you can't go yet, not after such a brilliant contribution. No, I need to interrogate it a little bit because what I love about what you've said, Louise, is that the comparisons don't matter. You made them, and no one's going to argue that what Starmer has done is on the same planet as just a few of the greatest hits of Boris Johnson that you just treated us to. I mean, in a moral universe, an ethical universe, one is an ant and one is an elephant. But you didn't even want the ant from Starmer, did you?
No.
And there it is. I mean, you're not lost forever, I don't think. I mean, an early misstep is forgivable. A pattern of behaviour is not.
I'm not sleeping well at the moment, because, well, I won't go into that. But
you can if you want.
But I'm it'll creep over me, and this kind of depression hits, and I think, for God's sake, it's the Prime Minister.
I suffer from this as well.
Why am I getting so wound up?
Because you're a patriot.
Yeah.
Because you want what's best for this country, and you've endured 14 years of seeing people claiming to be patriotic while filling their own boots, sticking their noses in the trough, promoting absolute incompetence, disseminating lies like it was going out of fashion, inflicting obvious harm upon the country while claiming it was a win from Brexit right through to Liz Truss's. And Starmer probably is very, very different from that. I still think he is. But
he is. But
this is a chip in the sugar. This is a chip in the sugar, isn't it? This is
what's happened? What's happened?
I don't know. And that's do you know, you've done a better job than me of setting up this conversation, because it doesn't make sense, does it?
Email my MP. I can't remember his name. It was Kevin Jones, I think, but I think he retired, and it's some guy who doesn't even live in the area, Labour MP. So I'll email him when I've got time. I've just got.
And yet, on the other hand, we both see, I think, that in the great scheme of things, it's not important in terms of matters of state, affairs of state, or international relations. The good news this week, picked up rather powerfully by Robert Peston, is that Starmer is to reintroduce weekly meetings for the National Security Council. Previous incumbents at number 10 either didn't care enough about foreign policy, in the case of Sunak, I'm told, or didn't really like chairing meetings where there was no opportunity to sort of march around the room blasting on your own trumpet like Boris Johnson. But it doesn't matter. They were very important to David Cameron for balance. So I think Louise has hit on something there that I didn't fully articulate myself, in that you can't be squeaky clean. You can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But this just feels like such a stupid mistake to have made. Is it greed? Here's 20 grand's worth of clothes that you could afford to pay for yourself. Not immediately. I don't know if he's got 20 grand in his current account in the way that Sunak did. And then someone says, oh, don't worry about that, I'll cover it. I mean, I'd take it. Of course I would. But I'm a radio presenter. I'm not Prime Minister. I am also the only journalist, I think, in the country who has ever sold a suit to a Prime Minister. But judging by some of the messages in my inbox, it may be that I've shared that anecdote with you too often already. Matt's in Wakefield. Matt, what would you like to say?
Hiya, James. What I wanted to say is, do you think Keir Starmer and David Lammy are trying to convince us that they can't afford their own clothes and glasses?
No, clearly. I mean, no one's claiming that. That's kind of the whole point about why Starmer's ended up in such a silly position.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I just fail to see how you can run a country, and I understand the argument that we don't want to send them out in the grandmother's old knitted jumper onto the international stage.
It's almost like an ITV Christmas drama, that, isn't it? When someone gets elected to Prime Minister, who I suppose we nearly had it with the last Labour leader, but it would turn up in a tea cosy and a pair of sandals for a meeting with the President of the United States of America. But I mean, we're not really talking about Starmer's 20 grand's worth of gear, but actually that's coming into focus as well, isn't it? Just say no. Just say no. No thanks.
Yeah,
I'll buy my own clobber. And I don't care how much the other lot have taken in donations. We don't do that. We don't take donations.
Correct, James. It's the principle. Yeah. Principle, isn't it? The principle. It's 19 grand. I mean, is obscene if you compare it to what pensioners get for a state pension, what people on low incomes have to struggle with every year.
I mean, it is to you and me, but it depends which end of the telescope you're looking through. It's small change to the bloke that gave it to him. So it's not as if that and Wahid Ali's tax bill will be eye-watering by our standards. So it's not as if it's money that could have gone in an alternative direction. It would have just sat in Wahid Ali's bank account accruing even more interest if he hadn't given it to Keir Starmer. So why do you think he said yes then? Just don't stop to think. Just answer me straight from the gut. Why would he say, yeah, all right, I'll take that?
Because he's out of touch and he wouldn't understand the implications.
No, that's not the answer, is it? Because, I mean, what's going on in his head? He's not saying in his head, I'm out of touch and I don't understand the implications. What's he saying in his head? Is he just going, crikey, I've never had any clothes like that before. I'm the son of a toolmaker.
Well, he's a millionaire, isn't he, Starmer? So I'm sure he's had expensive clothes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I honestly don't know what's going on in his head, James. I just think that he's not considered how this would look to the wider public.
Well, he got away with the 20 grand, so to speak. I mean, the widespread acceptance that it is, for good or for ill, a relatively normal bit of business. And I think that if this had been declared from the start, he'd have actually got away with this as well. But the failure to declare it because they didn't think they had to, and then discovering that they did and so declaring it, just makes it look like a cover-up. It's not an actual cover-up, but if I were advising the Prime Minister, I would invent the phrase over-disclose. Just declare everything. And then if you're not comfortable declaring it, or you're relieved that you don't have to, you shouldn't be taking it, right?
James O'Brien on LBC. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
It is 10:35 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Can I just take a moment? I like to give shouts out when the opportunity presents itself. I met a lovely young man on Friday who has set up a date stall in Seven Dials in Covent Garden. This is very London-centric, so I'll be brief. He's also got a stall in Borough Market, which if you're not from London and you're ever visiting, I really would put near the top of your list. It's a magnificent place to visit. You're not allowed to set up stall in Borough Market unless you've passed a deliciousness test. That's certainly my impression, and probably a provenance test as well. But Usman, who was utterly charming and absurdly pleased to see me on Friday, has two stores, one in Borough Market, one in Seven Dials in Covent Garden. He trades as the Date Sultan, and I don't know if you are a fan of dates. I was given some dates that had just got off the plane from Jordan last year or earlier this year, and I have to tell you, it was one of those moments. I thought I'd had all those moments in my life, like the first time you taste sushi or something like that. It was one of those moments, and I've had supermarket dates at Christmas where you just go, oh my days, how have I got to 51 or 52 years old without knowing how delicious these things can be? And if you have never had that moment, then my advice to you would be to check out Date Sultan, who also trade online. Lovely bloke, amazing business, and some of the most delicious things I've ever put in my mouth, ever. And that concludes my TED Talk. 10:36 is the time. Louise and Matt have kicked things off rather well. There's just a sense that this stinks, or at least it smells. And it's an entirely unnecessary smell. And it's beyond front pages. David puts it well. I feel very let down, James, because the first thing my wife said to me was, there you go, they're all the same. So what goes through Keir Starmer's head when Wahid Ali says to him, I'll pay for Victoria's clothes. I'll pay for your wife's clothes. How has this happened, do you think? That's the psychology of it, and we'll continue to discuss the politics. Phil's in Oxford. Phil, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
how are you doing?
Very well, mate. What's on your mind?
Good. Well, Louise, please don't be depressed. Let's be disappointed.
Yes, that's a better word. Yes.
Well, her word was the word she wanted to use, I think, obviously. I would be very depressed if the reaction to this doesn't turn out to be appropriately apologetic. My issue here really is what was going on in Keir Starmer's head was nothing about this. It was all about preparing to be Prime Minister and the workings of government.
So it wouldn't be beeping on his radar much at all?
No, not at all. Not at all. And I'm not being an apologist here.
No.
But there is that, to err is human, to forgive is divine. We can't do that until we come over the next day or two, hopefully, with seeing a suitable reaction.
And how much bandwidth should he even be dedicating to it now without looking like he's trying to sort of fend off the rabid right-wing media at the pass? But people like Louise deserve a slightly better explanation than they've received thus far, don't they? And arguably,
of course they do.
Arguably, we all do. There's two stories here, Phil. Susan describes one of them. She says, it's a stupid mistake, corrected on discovery and voluntarily put right. Those are the facts of the matter. But I don't don't know why I'm writing this down. I've written facts on one side of the column and feelings on the other. I've never done that before. I might use that every day. But feelings are different from facts, and the feelings speak more to accepting it at all, whether it's for good or for ill, whether it's against the rules or not, whether it's required to be disclosed or not. I think Matt put it quite well, didn't he, in Wakefield? Why does a man who's earning 170 grand a year and is not wealthy in Sunak terms, but is never going to be sleeping under Charing Cross Bridge anytime soon, why is he letting anybody pay for his wife's clothes?
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely agreed.
Well, hang on. It's a question, not a statement. Why is he letting anybody pay for his wife's clothes?
Just based on oversight, I think.
He knew it was happening. It just didn't cross his mind that it might look a bit off or might not.
Exactly.
Okay.
The distractions of the day job, which will obviously be very distracting, and in a sense, quite rightly so. There's an irony there, really.
I hear you. I hear you. I think that's generous, and you stress that you're not being an apologist for them, and I don't think that you are, but it might stretch the credulity of some people that they could accept £20,000 worth of largesse without really noticing or without thinking that it might be problematic. I guess we'd have to look at the register of members' interest, wouldn't we? We'd have to look at how commonplace these kind of gifts are. You look at hospitality. I mean, it's par for the course for an awful lot of politicians to accept stuff. It goes with the territory, and it only becomes problematic when it veers into conflict of interest territory. And it's hard to see how this might. Although we watch the story with interest. Thank you, Phil. My friend Nick puts it rather more caustically than anyone has managed to so far. He writes, "In fairness, surely he needs smart clothes when he's in." I'm going to get this right, actually. In fairness, surely he needs smart clothes when he's in Rome discussing how to treat refugees with an Italian fascist. Oof. John's in Bermondsey. John, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. First time calling to your show.
You're very welcome.
I've listened to you for years.
Thank you, mate.
Don't always agree with what you say, but I love how you present.
I can't talk to you then. This is an echo chamber. Didn't anybody tell you? You're not allowed to come on and disagree. No, anyway, carry on.
I'm absolutely totally disappointed with Keir Starmer. When the election was building up, he was promoting the fact that things were going to be different. It was all going to be, we were going to get back to honest, straight talking politics. And here we are, a few months after that. And this has
he's
come
being,
to light.
he is being honest and straight talking. He hasn't tried to cover it up. The minute he was told that he had to disclose it, he's disclosed it.
Yeah, but as you said earlier, if in doubt, you would over-disclose. When you're in the public eye,
I would, but I don't know any politician ever has.
And that's
I still would. But that's where you get that's where you leave the door ajar for slightly disingenuous suggestions that they're all as bad as each other. Why does it matter?
That's how I feel.
I know you do. In the great scheme of things, is that you've got some politicians are permanently in America trousering huge sums of money to give speeches alongside far-right Austrian MEPs. You've got Boris Johnson papering his house with with £50 notes, I think, at one point seemed to be roughly what they were worth. And Starmer transparently takes glasses and clothes from a donor and then opaquely takes £5,000 worth for his wife. Why does it matter compared to the other stuff when it's chalk and cheese? Because I agree with you that it does, but I haven't got down to the psychology of it. It's because we expected the worst of what went before and we expected better of him.
In my opinion, it matters because it extends the fact that it's them and us. So I work in public sector. I'm a police officer.
Yeah.
And I
can't take anything from anyone, can you?
And again, if you do, you disclose it and you're not allowed to take many items and all the rest of it. But again, I don't get any help towards, nor would I expect it, any help for clothing or...
Well, you did when you were in uniform.
In uniform, I did, but not now.
That's not an entirely glib point, is that in a way, they are now required to wear a uniform of sorts.
Well, it's a suit, isn't it?
But they couldn't turn up dressed like I routinely turn up for work, could they? Either of them. It would be unacceptable. And
no, but again, the question is, why do you have to have top end, high branded fashion items when you can get reasonable priced clothing where you can look quite smart and presentable?
Yeah, it is just that it's the what's the thing? It's the optics of it. Why? Is £5,000 worth of free clothes for your wife? No, you're all right, mate. Put your wallet away. We'll pay our own way. I mean, maybe we're being naive, or we're not.
Again,
go on.
You mentioned earlier about his 170,000 a year, whatever it is.
Yeah.
We don't know what his disposable income is. Again, I'm not trying to defend him, but as you said earlier, everyone lives to their means, and the more money you earn, sometimes the more money you spend on living. So you don't have a lot of money for that sort of thing, maybe.
No, yeah. I mean, I doubt it, but I've been finding the money in one go. I mean, suddenly to go from having every outfit you wear scrutinised internationally, that is quite a big deal. But I don't know that it justifies. I mean, what's the biggest problem here? Taking it, not disclosing it until you discovered that you had to disclose it, all of it or none of it. I don't know. Let me think what my answer to that question would be. I think that. Thinking you didn't have to disclose it. I think that's what has annoyed me. And this is probably not fair, because I'm not aware off the top of my head of any politician who has ever brought to the attention of the authorities or the public things that they didn't have to, that might make them look bad. But I just expected, or at least I hoped, for rather more. But it's, I mean, as we've established beyond all reasonable doubt, the desperate attempts to either ignore Boris Johnson's form in this field, or to pretend that Starmer's is in any way comparable, is, I mean, beyond idiot's corner, actually. But and also a few messages coming in saying you're underestimating how important appearance is. I don't know that I am. I really don't. I know I'm not a woman, but I don't know that you need to take. I mean, what previous prime ministers' wives have taken money from? So who you'd have to look at: Gordon Brown, Tony Blair. I can't imagine that Philip May took a £5,000 worth of free clobber from a Conservative Party. I don't know, but none of us like it. No one is going to come out and say absolutely justified, nothing to see here, or at least not so far. The phone lines are still open. It's 10:45.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:48. I quite like this from Hunt, who writes, the important thing to me is that they think it's fine as long as they declare it. It's not fine. How unreasonable would it be to say that I won't take any personal advantage from anybody while I am in politics? I appreciate that would reach a heck of a lot further than Keir Starmer, and, there are obviously much more egregious scandals in very, very recent memory. But David Cameron said once that the next big scandal in politics would be lobbying, and then did precisely nothing about it. If someone wants to give you 20 grand, the idea that they want absolutely nothing in return seems to me to be a tad naive. Wahid Ali is a slightly different proposition, because he is sort of part of the machine, if you like. He encourages other people to donate to the party as well. They organised the party at Downing Street, the Victory Celebration Party, which would have included donors. That's why he was temporarily in possession of a Downing Street pass that people pretended to get their knickers in a twist about. But I think good people are discombobulated by this one. It's not just Boris Johnson cheerleaders who suffered from weapons-grade myopia for the duration of his premiership, pretending to be cross. I think that people do feel a little bit let down. But are they justifiably let down? Or is this just business as usual that most of us are not fully aware of, because it doesn't attract the sort of attention that this particular story is attracting? 10:50 is the time. Sue's in Thurrock. Sue, what would you like to say?
I was going to say, with all of this thing, I actually blame the media to a certain degree. It's only after the last 10, 15 years since Samantha Cameron was in number 10 with David, that there's been this obsession with what the Prime Minister's spouse, actually I'd say wife, because it's only with women.
You didn't spend much time checking out what Mr. Truss was wearing, did we?
No. Absolutely. And, and even on the day after the election, Angela Rayner was going into number 10, and all the media were going on. The first thing the media were going on about was her green suit.
Yeah, you're right.
The only time I've ever heard criticism of what a man's been wearing was Rishi Sunak's shoes.
Yeah.
But that's the only thing. It's always around the women. And so, if Lady Starmer was going out looking like a sack of spuds, there'd be complaints about that all over the media.
But you don't go out looking like a sack of spuds, do you?
No, but
and you don't need $5,000 off a millionaire to make sure that you never do. So, do you see what I mean?
I do see what you mean, but they're out on the campaign trail, and
yes,
sort of a lot of these, and there are a lot of events to actually go to. That's quite, and if she'd worn something twice, the media would have had to go about that.
Yes. Yes. I hear you. So, I mean, I hope we haven't fallen into... I know when you blame the media, usually you don't mean me. But actually, I wonder whether I've sort of fallen into the trap of thinking, no, I haven't. I think it's important to talk about this, Sue. You're perfectly entitled to say it's not a big deal. But people who feel that Starmer's... the necessity of putting clear blue water... between
and the other big difference, other big difference is that he's actually put this out and he's put that out there. He hasn't waited to get caught.
No, that's actually true. They discovered that they needed to disclose it while discussing something else and thought, oh, crikey, that must mean that we should have declared that as well.
And I think that is the one redeeming feature about it.
And there won't be any room for that kind of nuance in some of the coverage that is obviously designed to enrage people who were supremely comfortable about... well, they all end up lobbying. David Cameron ended up lobbying, didn't he, for a company that subsequently went bust, although he wasn't technically a politician at the time. What about the question of what do you get in return? If someone gave you $20,000 or gave your partner $5,000, would they honestly you'd be doing it supremely confident that there was quid but no quo, Sue?
This man is a Labour donor.
Yes.
And from what I read, I don't know, he sort of gave a significant amount to the actual
campaign.
Yes. But not as much as that bloke that made those horrible comments about...
You mean the massive racist Frank Hester?
That's the one, yeah.
No, just 20 million quid.
Nearly, and I think this ran into the tens of thousands that he actually gave to the campaign.
And as far as we're aware, he's not a massive racist like the massive racist Frank Hester.
No.
Who James cleverly this weekend declined to confirm that they wouldn't take even more money from the massive racist Frank Hester. Yeah, I mean, again, I mean, where is the line between context and comparison and whataboutery? I think we're firmly on the right side of that line, Sue, but we need to be aware of its existence. Actually, to slightly challenge what Sue said, Michael Foot came in for a lot of criticism about his appearance, particularly, I think, on a Remembrance Sunday appearance at the Cenotaph, fairly or unfairly. And, of course, I think David Cameron once told Jeremy Corbyn to smarten himself up, didn't he? I think referenced his mother or something and told... It's not often I find myself defending Jeremy Corbyn, but I'm prepared to on this occasion. The idea of David Cameron lecturing Jeremy Corbyn on matters sartorial while he was flexing his muscles for a lucrative deal with that Greensill outfit shortly after leaving Parliament is, in retrospect, somewhat unsavoury. Thank you, Sue. Tom's in Ongar. Tom, what would you like to say?
I think Starmer represents something sort of bigger than Starmer. He kind of, at least for me, it was that hope that things were going to change.
Yeah.
And all of that, they're all the same. This kind of fueled it. It reminds me, it was in one of the Batman films. I can't remember which one, but when Harvey Dent turns and someone says he was supposed to be the best of us. And I think
Harvey Dent did rather more than accept $5,000 worth of free frocks for his wife, didn't he?
Yeah, I know, but the way the papers cover it, he might as well have done. It's hard to say. But, when I heard about it, and I was just like, what a muppet. Because it was probably just one of those things where he was like, oh, sure, yeah, whatever, we'll deal with that later. It was probably just something as small as that, but they're gonna dig their claws in and make it seem so much worse, and you just think it could so easily been avoided.
I think you've nailed it, because when they dig their claws in, most of the time we can laugh at it, we can stick it on Unhinged headline, or we can point out how ridiculous it is, but there is actually a kernel here of truth. There is it doesn't matter that the politicians they support, the politicians they've got on their own payroll, did infinitely worse things than this. A couple of messages saying to me, I hold Labour to higher standards, James, because I expect better from Labour.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And he's let us down, but the actual money itself is neither here nor there. I think it was just that hope that politics was going to change. And I think it's still there, but it's just dented it a bit.
I think you're right. And, you know, I don't know whether this veers into the realms of unsavoury blokishness or misogyny, but no, it's definitely not misogyny. But Lady Starmer generally looks brilliant before she was in receipt of donations from Wahid Ali. But whether or not you can sustain that level of brilliance without repetition, I suppose, is something that well, I presume it would actually be quite tricky, but it's still not excusing necessarily the perception of wrongdoing. So, yeah, Tom, thank you. Last word probably, glancing at the clock, or we may squeeze in one more. Cumby's in Redbridge. Cumby, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello,
it's been a long time since I've been able to get through, which speaks to the calibre of your callers.
Doesn't it? Well, no, just the quantity, not necessarily the quality, Cumby, but we cross our fingers and carry on.
Absolutely. I think you just said exactly what I was going to say, is that Starmer and Labour came into this premiership on the basis of the perception of humility. There was a lot of talk about how his wife was in the NHS, which gives the perception that, you know, we are humble people. We don't go out and about to be flashy, etc., etc. Yes. And while I completely accept that as a statesman, you have to present yourself in a very, very at a level that is higher than the normal person. I mean, I used to work for TM. I used to work for Cirrus Terrio a long time ago, before they changed their name to whatever they're called now in the city. Back in my uni days, and they had very, very good suits. I was 19.
How old are you now? I should have asked actually.
I'm 41.
Okay, because there was a Cirrus Terrio in Worcester, just down the road from River Island. And if someone came in, I don't know if I should say this, I'm sure River Island is different now, but if someone came in who was clearly looking for some schmutter of a slightly higher order than I could provide them with as a River Island salesman, I used to send them down. I used to send them down to Cirrus Terrio, yeah.
Yeah.
And I actually, between you and me, don't tell anyone, but I had a staff discount reciprocal arrangement with a lad who worked there. So I'd use his staff discount if I wanted to get something from Cirrus Terrio. And if he wanted some new jeans or something, because we stocked brands, we had Kickers and Levi's. If he wanted something from River Island, I used to put it through on my staff discount back in River Island. Keep that under your hat, though. Keep that under your hat, Cumby.
Yeah. Sadly, I never had that. But I used to have a lot of city guys coming in, you know, buying very, very good suits. Yeah. More recently, I've been buying mine from TM Lewin, Charles Terriot, etc. Yeah. It is possible to get something that makes you look, and with a little bit of adjustments or tailoring, it is very possible to look, you know, extremely well put together on a suit that doesn't have to
such an avoidable, even if it's a mere hiccup, it's an entirely avoidable hiccup, isn't it?
And then it presents an impression of something that is so far from the truth. But as you've said so many times on your show, a lie is halfway around the world before the truth comes out. And the truth of this small thing... Before
the truth has got its trousers on. Get it right, because it's quite pertinent to this story. Before the truth has got its Cirrus Terrio trousers on. Okay, last word on this, which you've just made me realise, and I've missed right up until this point, that actually, I'm pretty sure that if they identified that Lady Starmer was wearing a dress that cost, let's say, in excess of £500, or Keir Starmer was wearing a suit that cost in excess of £750, I'm pretty sure they'd turn that into a story anyway about how out of touch they are and how on earth can they be walking around in a suit that expensive while taking away winter fuel payments from the pensioners, even if they had paid for it themselves.
100%.
So that's quite a helpful punctuation mark in the entire conversation, actually, is that, yes, we'd rather this hadn't happened. But that earlier caller who described them getting their claws in, they'd have got their claws into this somehow, regardless of who paid for the clothes or whatever the hell they were wearing, because that's all they've got. It's what they do. 11 o'clock is the time. Thank you, Cumby. Oh, I didn't do the John Major anecdote. How about that? That's probably the first time that there has been an opportunity for one of my most overused and hackneyed, well-rehearsed anecdotes, and I've only got 11. That's probably the first time that I've had a perfect opportunity for it, and somehow I failed to find the time to squeeze it in.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
I can't believe we got through an entire hour about Keir Starmer and his wife accepting free clothes from a Labour Party donor without mentioning as Shiv has done in a tweet that I'll read shortly, that the Johnsons didn't even pay for their own food. Do you remember? They were having fancy deli dinners delivered around the back door of Downing Street. The Daily Mail has managed to conduct several pages of Amanda Platel has written an entire piece about the Starmers accepting clothes so they look good in public, without mentioning that Boris Johnson, who of course their colleague indeed, Boris Johnson, actually didn't even, never mind the wallpaper and the waste paper baskets, the lamps and the carpets and rugs, they didn't even pay for their own flipping dinner. I bet Carrie Johnson didn't buy her own clothes, suggests Shiv. I don't know, actually, when that might be the point. They didn't buy their own food, James. It won't have been by donation, though. She'll have been sent the clothes rather than the money. And the last word on this for now from Ali. Having listened to the wider debate around this subject, James, when I'm Prime Minister, I'm absolutely taking the free stuff. And that is a position, a perspective in which I suspect many of us can concur. I said last word. I'll read you this because I don't know. And it would be a little bit, even by my standards, it would be a little bit self-referential to do this as an actual topic. But I want you to take Paul's words to heart. In fact, I think you should write them down and have them to hand every morning for the foreseeable future, because I am worried about this. I am genuinely worried about this. Paul writes, just pause for a moment, James. Do you think you might be subconsciously overcompensating on this matter due to your promise to hold the new government to the same level of account as the last lot? If not, then continue. If yes, then recalibrate. I don't know. It crossed my mind, but I don't know. So be aware. If you think that I am overcompensating sometimes, because how can you possibly hold this account? How can you get as cross with this government as you did with the last few? You simply can't if you're even close to honest. But of course, that brings us back to the right-wing media. 6 minutes after 11 is the time. What do you think a racially aggravated public order offence looks like? Somebody screaming the N-word, perhaps, in public. Some of the posts that we saw on social media in the run-up to and during and the aftermath of the Farage riots. The P-word, perhaps, being bandied about with contempt and directed at identifiable named individuals, suggesting that people deserve to suffer, either materially or physically, because of their ethnicity, calling perhaps for hotels full of asylum seekers to be set on fire. I fairly straightforward examples from relatively recent memory of what a racially aggravated public order offence would look like. Nesreen Malik writes a characteristically superb column on this issue in today's Guardian newspaper. An innocent person being threatened with violence or abuse on account of their ethnicity. We have some fairly clear pictures, I think, of what a racially aggravated public order offence would or should look like. Nesreen writes this morning, I would wager that your mental catalogue does not include the figure of a smiling brown woman holding up a placard depicting a coconut tree with pictures of Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman pasted on it. You've probably seen that photograph of that smiling brown woman with that coconut tree and those pictures of Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman pasted on it. To my mind, almost unbelievably, that woman, Mariha Hussain, found herself in a magistrate's court last week facing charges of racially aggravated public order. She was charged after a placard at a pro-Palestine or pro-ceasefire march, whichever you prefer, described, of course, as a hate march by Suella Braverman. So she was maligning every single person on it, not just the small minority who deserve to come to the attention of the authorities, but every single person on it. And once it was circulated on social media, she was identified, she was arrested, she was charged, and she found herself in court. And I still can't quite believe it, actually. I still can't quite believe it. I wouldn't use the pejorative coconut, personally, to describe a person of colour because I am white. And this, I think, illustrates some of the difficulties of binary discussions about bigotry and racism. There are things that I would not be comfortable saying. I mean, most obviously, the example of how the hip-hop community has sort of reclaimed the N-word from haters, but never to the degree that a white person would be comfortable bandying it around, unless I suppose you were hip-hop royalty, in which case you probably do get a form of pass on that issue. But it's not binary. Do you see what I mean? Forgive the rather obvious pun, but it's not as black and white as you might think it could be or even should be. And it's also evolving. It's also constantly changing. Language is constantly evolving, but so too is the nature of offence. You know, things that you could do in the 1970s would make your hair fall out if someone did it now. I appreciate that there are public figures like 30p Lee and others who are keen to bring back the stuff that was acceptable in the 70s but is profoundly offensive now, because either they're too thick to understand the nature of social evolution, or they're supremely comfortable causing epic offence to people that they hold in contempt on account of their immutable characteristics. I don't know. I'm just asking questions. But the idea of calling somebody of colour complicit in, I guess at one extreme you would call it white supremacism, wouldn't you? You'd call it a form of white supremacism, or complicit in discriminatory practices. Well, that seems to me to be quite uncontroversial. First message in, it's racist, it's very simple. I think you are very simple. You'd have to explain to me why it's racist, to which the answer would be, it's an insult that can only be directed at people of colour. To which I would add, by other people of colour. So if you want to call someone a race traitor, that's not a racist accusation. That's accusing the other person of being complicit in racism. So I think in the first instance, I'm more interested in contributions from people who could conceivably either use or receive the insult coconut, and the question of how the hell this woman ended up in court. Because I think it's actually of a piece with some broader moves in society at the moment. I think that it is a little bit like the attempts to deny the reality of colonialism. I think it actually sits alongside those desperate attempts to castigate the National Trust for having the audacity to put information about the house that you're visiting in the house that you're visiting. Information about where the money with which the house was built had come from. Most obviously plantations and slavery, of course, but people hate to think about it. I don't understand why. No one's holding you responsible for things that happened 200 or 300 years ago, but people hate to think about it. And I think this is, I could be wrong, 0345 6060 is the number that you need. I think this is of a similar flavour. You know, I can't. Does anyone need me to explain why coconut is an insult? The idea is that you're brown on the outside but white on the inside. So you are of colour, but you are complicit in colour-based discrimination, which, in the context of white supremacism, it's a fairly obvious accusation. And here's something that I haven't thought about before, or I haven't shared with you before. I mentioned to you last week, it popped up in a book that I'm reading, 300 million Indians in India 100 years ago and 150,000 white British people who ruled the entire bloody place. How? How do you end up? I mean, obviously there was an awful lot of killing and an awful lot of unpleasantness, but there was also a shift from the days of the East India Company to the days of the Victorian Empire. And in the days of the East Indian Company, there was a lot more symbiosis. All right, we were ripping the raw materials out of the country at a rate of knots and shipping the profits and indeed the raw materials back to Britain. But there wasn't a sort of a Western equivalent of the caste system in place. There wasn't a genetic or moral superiority. There wasn't a genetic or moral superiority in place. And in order for one of the theses of the book that I'm reading is that in order for 150,000 white people to enjoy dominion over 300 million brown people, you have to successfully persuade a significant swathe of the brown people that white people are morally or genetically superior. And that was a real penny drop moment for me. I'd never really spent enough energy unraveling it. I got very, very close while reading Satnam Sangira's book, Empire Land, which should be required reading for every school child in the country if you want to build a better future than we have a past or a present. But I'd never thought about it like that. I've told you a few times that I'm of a generation that used to feel a bizarre swell of pride when I saw how much of the map used to be pink, how much of the globe used to constitute the British Empire. And, of course, that glow of pride, that warm swell, disappears the more you learn about how that dominion was achieved. But that's to do with massacres, and that's to do with concentration camps, and that's to do with slavery and quite well-documented atrocities and holocausts. It's not to do with psychology. I'd never thought properly about the psychology before. And you cannot have a country where 150,000 white men enjoy dominion over 300 million brown men and women and children unless you have successfully endorsed a notion of moral superiority. And it's only going to work if enough brown people have bought into it, right? Otherwise, it's not going to work. Otherwise, you're all going to be Gandhis. Otherwise, they call them terrorists and they call them guerrillas, but the indigenous people who want to throw out the invader would have succeeded decades, if not centuries previously. You can only have a system in which 150,000 white men enjoy complete dominion over 300 million brown men and women if you have successfully created the idea that they have a moral, a genetic, or even a God-given right to do so. Which means that the brown people going along with the white supremacy, the white dominion, are open to the accusation of being brown on the outside but white on the inside, or at the very least are complicit in the discrimination. They are complicit in the race-based discrimination, even though they're on the wrong side of it, even though they're on the receiving end of it, because it's like an ethnic equivalent of knowing your place. I find it impossible, as you know, to separate class from race in these kind of conversations. So who fascinates us the most on this program? The ordinary working Brit who repeatedly votes against their own interests, who is persuaded to vote against their own interests on taxation legislation, on the Brexit referendum, on trade union legislation, strike constantly persuaded to vote against their own interests. They are deferential. They are cap-doffing forelock tuggers. They're good people a lot of the time. They've been conditioned into this place for hundreds of years, but they think that somebody like Jacob Rees-Mogg is somehow better than them. They think that Boris Johnson is somehow better than them. The class equivalent, if you like, of supremacism. And they are complicit in it. The message or the phrase I get is often working class Tories. It doesn't make sense philosophically or politically. Why would you want to belong to a political ideology that looks down its nose at you and thinks that you are cannon fodder, both literally in times of war and metaphorically in times of peace? Answer, you know your place. You have been persuaded of the moral supremacy, or even perhaps the genetic supremacy of the ruling classes, the owning classes. And then you throw in a side order of second-hand envy. Why on earth would you be against a wealth tax if you haven't got any wealth? Well, as Steinbeck put it, there's no such thing as poverty in Dust Bowl-era America, just temporarily frustrated millionaires. I'm on the wrong side of unfair laws, but I might be on the right side of them one day, so I'm in favour of unfair laws that discriminate against me. It's the most fascinating element of the human condition for me. Certainly if you've got any interest whatsoever in hierarchies, in distribution, in equality, in fairness, the people who are complicit in their own persecution, complicit in their own oppression, are absolutely crucial to understanding how the world has worked and continues to. But I can say all the stuff about class. I can't say the stuff about ethnicity because I'm white. I can talk about privilege. I can talk about the benefits, if you like, of this inequality, of this oppression, because I'm on the right side of it. But I can't accuse Suella Braverman or Rishi Sunak or James Cleverly of complicity in the oppression of brown people or immigrant families with anything like the freedom that I could were I a member of an ethnic minority or a non-white immigrant family. I tweeted about it once, and it was one of those rare occasions where I caused epic unintentional offence. As you know, I'm a great fan of causing intentional offence, but I do find it, I'm going to be completely honest, I do find it more noticeable when somebody with immigrant parents rails against immigration in a very Daily Mail fashion. I find it more noticeable. I find it at first glance harder to process when somebody who is the children of economic refugees or economic migrants like Suella Braverman dreams of deporting people to far-flung African countries with no prospect of return. I find it harder in the first instance to get my head around than I do when it is a white person, whether they're descended from the Huguenot refugees like Farage's family is, or whether it's the cosplaying Victorian grandson of a lorry driver like Jacob Rees-Mogg. I don't know why, and I shouldn't, because if you're brown or black, you've got as much right to be a little bit racist towards refugees and immigrants as anybody else has. And I get that, and often people are. But to call Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman or to imply that they are coconuts, that they are brown on the outside and white on the inside, how is that offensive? 0345 6060 973. And of course, by asking you the question, how is that offensive, you can also call me. Indeed, I urge you to call me and tell me why it isn't. If you fancy a real humdinger, have a crack at how the hell did this end up in court? Was Braverman Home Secretary at the time? We'd have to check the dates, wouldn't we? I think she probably was Home Secretary at the time. How the hell did this end up in court? And how is it offensive to suggest that in a society where race-based inequality is baked in, for people in power who are complicit in that race-based inequality to be singled out and criticised? How is that? Well, listen, and if I'm missing something or if I'm getting this wrong, 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. It's 11:21.
James O'Brien on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It is 24 minutes after 11. I think Nick Robinson on a podcast recently, not Nick Robinson, it was on Nick Robinson's podcast that James Cleverly talked about how he'd really come down hard on the police when he was Home Secretary and given them a right kick up the backside. I don't know how much influence a Home Secretary can have over what police do and do not do. I mean, more than you and me have. But Suella Braverman was Home Secretary when Mariha Hussein was arrested and charged and taken to court for carrying a picture of a tree with photographs of Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak stuck on it. A coconut tree, suggesting that they are coconuts, i.e. brown on the outside and white on the inside. How the hell did that end up in court? And of course, feel free to phone me and tell me why it should have done. And in fact, you disagree with the decision of the magistrates to acquit her on all counts. Sahara is in Leicester. Sahara, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. You all right?
Yeah, very well, mate. How are you?
I'm good, actually. So first thing I want to say is thank you for being comfortable enough to talk about this, because there's plenty of white people that ain't.
Well, hang on. Look, some are absolutely adamant that it is incredibly racist and you shouldn't be able to do it ever. So they're very comfortable talking about it. I think you mean people...
I mean the whole issue, the wider issue, and you went back to colonialism and stuff like that as well. So thank you for that. And I'd say in regards to the term coconut...
Yeah.
It's a difficult one with Suella and Suella especially, because this is the woman that declared that multiculturalism has failed, and as a woman of colour who is in a position, I mean, I can't even get into that because it doesn't make any sense.
No, I agree.
But so for her to be on the side of that, whether she's offended or not, or whether Rishi was offended or not, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if they're not offended, because I don't know how in with the culture
no,
they
also,
are.
particularly Braverman, is very much of the view that nobody should really be offended by anything when she's talking about...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because that's going woke, isn't it?
Yeah,
so
that's the culture war.
Yeah, so it's kind of like you can't be on both sides of the argument, but going back to whether it's offensive or not, and I'm going to... I don't really want to do this, but... So there was a time...
You got me worried now.
No, it's nothing major. It's just going against my point and my issue with the Tories. So there was a time when Kwasi was it was the Chancellor, there was a Labour politician who said that someone was superficially black. Well, said he was superficially black.
Yes, you're right.
And that, which is basically the equivalent of saying coconut.
Yeah, of course.
And it's kind of, for the stuff like when she's not a black person to say...
It was Rupert Hook.
Yeah, Rupert Hook, thank you. So when Rupert Hook said that, she said that about a black man, it's coming from an Asian person, and it's kind of, and I think where it comes to black people, from my experience, from how I've seen it used and how, it's used and used on people I know or whatever, it's kind of, there's a kind of undertone with black people. It's like what coconut means when referred to a black person is that they're getting above their station, or, terms like superficially black. It's kind of, this person is not what being black is, which is socioeconomically lower down and, stuff like that. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
No, you are making sense. I mean, Keir Starmer called Rupert Hook's comments racist. She did go a little bit further. And I didn't understand this bit. She said, if you hear him on the Today programme, you wouldn't know he's black. That's of a slightly different order from accusing somebody of colour of upholding a fundamentally racist social structure, which seems to me to be supremely uncontroversial. Context.
You think the coconut thing is uncontroversial, or
to accuse for a brown person to accuse a brown person, or a black person to accuse a black person of helping to uphold a racist order, a racist structure. You'd have to work quite hard to explain to me where the offence lies in that. Yeah, I mean, you can defend yourself if you're Suella Braverman or Rishi Sunak. You can say categorically not, but to do that, you'd have to say the country isn't racist, or I'm not contributing to racist structures or racist tropes. Meanwhile, I'm dreaming of deporting refugees, and I'm doing nothing about the institutional racism in the Metropolitan Police Service.
Despite the fact there's nothing about me that's white, and I am a child of refugees, at least immigrants anyway.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know where we go to get the person who tells us that it is offensive. Do we find the person of colour who is routinely called a coconut and thinks it's unfair, and do they refuse, or do they not acknowledge the possibility of it sometimes being fair when it's applied to other people? I don't know. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. Listen, it can be offensive. Uncle Tom is, of course, another phrase that is bandied around in a very, very similar space. But it doesn't mean that it's criminal. And it doesn't mean that it's not a fair criticism sometimes, that somebody is complicit in an unfair structure. You'd have it with Irish Catholics in Ireland under British colonial rule. You'd have Irish Catholics who were accused of, frankly, they were accusing each other of everything all the time, but you would have loads of Irish Catholics who were accused of, and they were. They would be working on behalf of the landowners. They would be turning their own people out of their homes during the potato famine so that the land could be turned over to sheep farming. What are you going to call them? I don't know what the word actually was. Someone will no doubt enlighten me. But it is a lot more nuanced, perhaps, than this court case would seem to allow.
James O'Brien. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
11:33 is the time. Extraordinary events at the oldest Jewish newspaper, I think, in the world, the Jewish Chronicle. No one's quite sure who owns it. But if I told you that a man on the board of the BBC, a non-executive director of the BBC, the last time we checked, was the front man for whoever it is that owns it, is presiding over a regime in which blatantly false pro-Netanyahu propaganda has been published. 9 articles by the same journalist whose own CV appears to be somewhat exaggerated or embellished. And yet a man called Robbie Gibb, who was given a knighthood by Theresa May, he is a non-executive director of the BBC with some responsibility for editorial policy, including on matters Middle Eastern, is the de facto owner of the Jewish Chronicle and presided over one of the worst scandals so if you take the importance of the issue as seriously as we do, it's one of the worst scandals I can remember. And he's still in post at the BBC. We'll catch up with Alan Rusbridger, who is something of an expert in matters media from all manner of angles, most notably as a former editor of The Guardian, in about 10 minutes on this very sad story, actually, for an awful lot of British Jews as well, who have either abandoned, in the case of many prominent columnists now, have abandoned the paper, or, as you tell me, felt for some time that it surrendered any claims to objectivity or even honesty some time ago. I'm afraid that accusation is now impossible to refute in the context of the latest story. Soup takers was the phrase I haven't come across. My Irish history isn't good enough, I'm afraid. It will be, because I got it on my list. It's one of the things I love learning about. Soup takers. So during the Great Hunger, Catholics who sort of crossed over to the sides of the oppressor were called soup takers. And do you know the origin of the word boycott is relevant here as well? So during the Irish Land War, as it were, there was an absentee English landlord. I think he lived in County Mayo, but he employed someone called Captain Boycott to chuck out tenants from farms who needed a 25% discount, they said, to keep their heads above water on their rent during the land war, and he offered them 10. So Boycott was ordered to evict 11 tenants. It's one of the things that brought Charles Parnell, who's the Irish leader at the time, and he gave an instruction that nobody should move in to the farms from which tenants have been evicted. That's where we get the word boycott from. So in the context of English oppression in Ireland, what would you call, if you did, and it worked brilliantly. Boycott was isolated. His workers down tools in the fields and stables. Staff in his own house stopped working. Local businessmen stopped trading with him. Even the local postman refused to deliver his mail. It's the first boycott, and his name has become a figure of speech, a boycott. So, but what in Ireland at the time would you have called somebody who did trade with Charles, but someone who helped to uphold the oppression? It's just an example of the normal population being free to choose to either join in to oppression or exploitation or resist it and reject it. And if you accept that Britain has quite a lot of racism baked into its social structures, then the insult coconut, perhaps, assumes a resonance. I don't know. Richard's in Stoke Newington. Richard, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hello, James.
Hello, Richard.
I think, I find the term coconut offensive.
Well, it's meant to be offensive, isn't it? That's the point. It's a question of whether it's justified or not.
Well, this is what I was going to say, right? So I find it offensive, but I don't think it should end up in court. Right, and it shouldn't end up in court. But it should be discouraged, I think.
Yes.
Right, and I mean, when I
Why?
say it shouldn't be, when I say it shouldn't end up in court, I mean it shouldn't end up in court if it's said by someone, if it's said by, for example, a black person, and it should be discouraged because it's standard, what I would say, standard plantation operation. Where if you are a white supremacist, for example, if you own a plantation, the first thing you'd want to do is get the fellow slaves to turn against each other instead of focusing on you, right? So if you successfully confuse those non-white people to believe in your superiority, it's your fault.
Yeah, but if you've got
white supremacists are the ones who are in control,
who benefit from it, but you've gone too far down the road already. Because what if you have non-white people who either through self-interest or genuine gaslighting or intellectual grooming genuinely believe in the superiority of the plantation owner, genuinely believe in a sort of form of genetic or moral superiority, and they derive their validation from being part of the ruling class, even as it enjoys dominion over people who look like them? Then what do you do?
Well, because I think the only reason that you would think that in the first place is if you have been successfully confused to believe that in the superiority.
Yes. So, but how do you push back against that then?
By pushing back against the white supremacists. If you don't know that you're supposed to be pushing back against those white supremacists who aren't superior to you, then you have been successfully confused.
You can do both.
By the white supremacists.
But surely
right?
the biggest obstacle to the target you describe would be the people who are fairly described as coconuts. Not because you're right. Sometimes it will be unfair. Sometimes you'll be called a coconut because you listen to rock music instead of rap at high school or something like that. But in the context of upholding an unfair system, upholding a system of government in which the Metropolitan Police Service can be routinely and repeatedly judged to be institutionally racist while claiming as Home Secretary that either it doesn't exist. They put out a statement, didn't they? They put a report out claiming there was no such thing as institutional racism. If you're complicit in that, what do you do to resist?
So okay. So what I was going to say is from what I've been able to see, the non-white supremacists are very, very successful at getting their victims to engage in, how can I say it, non-effective strategies of counter warfare. That's how I put it. Right?
Yeah, I do understand what you're saying.
Right. What I'm saying is non-white people name calling each other doesn't help you. That has never worked.
Well, I'm not going to.
Never worked.
Are you sure it's never worked? I just described. No, I admitted.
We're all still. Well, I'm trying to explain. I'm saying after we've done each other, after we've done name calling each other, we're still victims of racism, white supremacy, I think.
Yes, but after the Black Lives Matter. Hang on, stop interrupting me when I'm trying to interrupt you.
You're trying to interrupt you. Yeah.
It's outrageous behaviour. Institutional racism doesn't exist. That's from the government's own race commission in a landmark report. And you know that it does. We all know that it does. If you're a person of colour in that government and you are claiming that this is true, you're saying that don't focus on them, focus on the white people.
Yes.
But they're being used as camouflage.
Right. They will.
We're going to disagree about this.
Okay, I think it's impossible. Once we get our heads around that, it is impossible to have a system of racism, white supremacy without collaborators.
Yeah,
it's impossible. You can't get rid of no matter what sort. If you have a system that basically you're
what was apartheid era South Africa? I don't know, but apartheid era South Africa was probably the closest you get to having no collaborators.
Let me just finish my thought.
I will. Sorry.
Right. So if racism is, I look at racism as a system, right? That subjugates, dominates, mistreats black people in economics, education, entertainment, labor law, politics, religion, sex, and war. If you have such a system, how can you have such a system without collaborators? So if we look at that as a given, that there will always be collaborators for that system to exist in the first place, the only way to get rid of that system is to go against the people, the problem makers.
It's not either or. And here's the problem with. Can I tell you? No. I have to speak. Richard, I have to speak. I have to tell you why you're wrong. Yeah. That's what I'm paid for. I have to tell you why you're wrong. Okay. Because what you've got, the only earthly way in which you can deny that this country is still institutionally racist is by pretending that the fact that you are a brown Home Secretary or a black Foreign Secretary or a brown Prime Minister is proof that there is no racism. So in order to address the existence of institutional racism, you have to go for the people who claim that they're proof that there isn't institutional racism by dint of their own ethnicity and their own success. The scale and the success of what you call collaboration, I'd be a little bit shy of that word, but only for reasons of sensitivity. The scale and success of it is such that how can you not go after the exemplars? There is no racism in this country, and I can prove it because I'm a black Foreign Secretary or I'm a brown Prime Minister. How are you going to prove them wrong without talking about them?
Right. Okay. So
you've got 1 minute to. How are you going to prove them wrong without talking about them?
Right. We have to change the way that non-white people think about racism.
Not good enough. Not good enough. You can't do that. You've got to prove that person wrong without talking about him. How are you going to do it?
Okay. Right. So you focus on the way that a racist white supremacist system is run, and that is run by confusion.
It's not either or. Here is a black politician.
Confuse their victims.
No, I'm not arguing with you. You do that as well, but you're not answering my question. Here is a black politician, and there's about half a dozen of them that we could both name now, claiming that racism doesn't exist because they have been so successful in the Conservative Party. How do you prove them wrong?
Identify the person
without talking
without name calling that person. That's my point. That's why I said at the top.
Well, you called them collaborators.
I don't think. Right, I wouldn't use the word Okay, I wouldn't use the word.
You just used it 18 times.
Like that. No. I didn't say you called that person a collaborator.
But you just did.
That's not what I'm. No, good. Okay, I'm having a conversation with you.
What's the difference between a collaborator and a coconut?
They're both insults. That's why I said I wouldn't.
Yeah, but what's the difference behaviourally? What does a collaborator do that a coconut doesn't do as a word?
I'm saying non-white people are confused.
I know.
Are made confused about racism, right? So you can describe those people who are so confused to the extent that they wish to help slave masters, right?
As collaborators.
But you don't insult those.
But collaborator is an insult.
Calling them that.
Collaborator.
That's why I said I wouldn't use it to describe. Okay.
Well, then what word would you use? What single word would you use?
Confused, James. That's what I said.
But we're all confused. I'm confused. I'm not a collaborator. You need to convey collaboration.
But the victims of racism are more
you know it. You know that when you said collaborator, you said collaborator, you might as well have said coconut.
No, but I'm not saying that. I'm not saying the word collaborator to the black person or.
But confused doesn't tell me what they've done.
This is why I said we have to change the way that non-white people
but until we've changed the way that people think, what word are you going to use to describe the people you've described as collaborators if you're not going to use the word collaborator? I'll wait.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:49 is the time. We may return to some of that story after the 12 o'clock news, but I want to draw your attention to something different first. For the record, I think Richard was probably right, despite the volume of our ding-dong. I mean, it should clearly not end up in court, a case in which a person of colour has called another person of colour a coconut. But whether the offence it causes is gratuitous is moot, I think. Turn our attention next to a very different story. The headline in the Times today: columnists shun Jewish newspaper over false articles. And erring on the side of caution, they put the phrase false articles in quotes. Alan Rusbridger, editor of Prospect magazine, former editor of The Guardian, joins me to discuss this. There are two stories here, Alan. There is the story about malfeasance at the Jewish Chronicle, and then there is the story about the apparent owner, or certainly the frontman for whoever the owner is, and his continuing role influencing editorial policy and lecturing BBC journalists on impartiality. So we'll keep them separate if we can. Can you begin by explaining what the Jewish Chronicle stands accused of?
The Jewish Chronicle stands accused of running a number of articles by a man called Elon Perry, some of them extremely sensational and which really suited the agenda of Bibi Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, and a correspondent for the 972 website in Israel, David Reif, investigated one of these stories along with other Israeli journalists, and they concluded that the story was complete fantasy. They quoted the intelligence community at the IDF, calling them wild fabrications, 100% lies, and totally baseless. And he wrote this up about 10 days ago, and it took a long time for the Jewish Chronicle to do anything about it.
Ben Reif, I think, rather than David, but not alone, of course. Other Israeli media looking into this, and up to and including the Israeli Defense Force, weighing in on the story about the Philadelphia corridor and describing some of the stuff being published in a British newspaper aimed at the Jewish community as demonstrably and dangerously false.
Yeah, I mean, there's even a suggestion that this really was a leak from Bibi Netanyahu's office. That hasn't been proved, but this is what the intelligence community sources have been speculating. And the journalists then looked at this guy, Elon Perry, and found that many of the claims he made for himself, such as that he was a lecturer at Tel Aviv University, or that he took part in the 1976 Entebbe raid in Uganda, were baseless. So he has the feeling of somebody who is, how can one put it politely, unreliable.
Although he, of course, denies all the allegations, describes them as a witch hunt, and has said that he provided the newspaper with great stories and scoops. Put the resignation of several prominent columnists in context for us, if you can. Alan Hadley Freeman of the Sunday Times, Jonathan Friedland, one of your columnists when you were at The Guardian, still there now, David Aranovich, BBC presenter, former Times columnist. They have all, and David Baddiel has said he has no plans to write any more columns. They have all publicly and powerfully disowned, essentially, the current regime at the Jewish Chronicle.
Well, why it matters is that the Jewish Chronicle, at its best, represented or strove to represent the whole Jewish community in the UK. Now, in recent years, particularly since October the 7th, but I think before that, a lot of more liberal Jews in this country were very apprehensive about the line that the Jewish Chronicle was taking, which was very pro-Likud, very pro-Netanyahu. Somebody who was part of the consortium who recently took it over described it as my country, right or wrong. So it was really important for the editor, Jake Wallace-Simons, that these more liberal figures, Jonathan and Hadley and the two Davids, Aranovich and Baddiel, were there to act as a counterbalance to the overwhelming direction of the paper. So for them all to have up sticks is pretty devastating for the paper's reputation.
Which brings us to Robbie Gibb, doesn't it? Or Sir Robbie Gibb, to give him his full title. Former producer on one of Andrew Neil's BBC programmes, former head of politics at the broadcast Westminster Politics at the BBC during the Brexit referendum. What is his role? You wrote about this in Prospect some months ago, and we weren't entirely clear then. Are we any clearer now?
Not much, no. It is a curious thing happened in 2020. The Jewish Chronicle was in some financial trouble, and out of the blue, a group of the great and the good swooned in, and not all of them Jewish, and bought the paper in inverted commas because I don't think it was their own money. And Robbie Gibb appeared in Company's House as 100% owner of the Jewish Chronicle, though clearly he wasn't.
Because whoever is had to be in a position to write off £3.5 million worth of loan, I think.
Yeah, it was an investment of some millions, right. And you have to take on the ongoing losses of the paper, which are in hundreds of thousands. So it's clearly not Robbie Gibb. And I tried to find out who was the owner. And I met a complete blank wall. Nobody would say who the owner was. I asked the editor, and he said, well, that's not really my department. I struggle to think of any example in British history, let's say over the last 100 years, where a significant paper, we don't know who owns it. It's just unheard of. And yet that's the stance that they've continued to the day. And this is significant because Gibb, as the 100% owner of the Jewish Chronicle, if he still is, sits on the crucial key editorial standards committee of the BBC, which the chairman, Samir Shah, said is about to investigate the BBC's coverage of the Middle East and Gaza. I can't see how he can possibly sit on that committee and portray himself as a beacon of impartiality, sitting in judgment on BBC journalists when he has this ownership of this paper, and which is now mired in a crisis of its own.
So you think his position is untenable at the BBC?
I think there's no question that he can't sit on this editorial standards committee any longer, I think. And the fact that he signs up to transparency when he becomes a BBC director, and yet he refuses to say who owns this paper that he is down on paper as owning.
And, of course, not that long ago, we were reading reports that he was lecturing BBC journalists on impartiality itself.
He does lecture BBC journalists regularly on impartiality, and has even tried to intervene to stop appointments because he doesn't consider
This would be Jess Brammer, the former deputy editor of Newsnight, who he was keen not to see appointed to an executive position.
He stands on a pulpit of his own, lecturing about impartiality, and yet he seems not to be able to see the problem that his covert ownership, I say that in inverted commas because, as I say, he doesn't own them, but he refuses to say who does own it, of this paper, which is now, this is not the first time they've been in some ethical difficulties, and the regulator, IPSO of the press, was even invited to conduct a formal investigation into the standards. And one of the reasons for turning it down was they said it had new owners, which made me laugh, because they don't know who the owners are.
Does not know or does not care. How much of this should be concerning Lisa Nandy, the relatively newly installed Secretary of State for Media? But I'm thinking of the BBC role.
Samir Shah was up in front of a House of Lords committee the other day, and he, as the incoming chair of the BBC, said he thought it was a real problem that 10 out of the 14 board members of his board were appointed by the government. Now, we saw the problem that the last regime the Tory government had in trying to influence the BBC, trying to make appointments to the BBC, trying to make appointments to Ofcom. Gibb was in that up to his elbows in those machinations, and the BBC lives or dies by being independent. So I think Lisa Nandy has got to think carefully about how she can protect the BBC from this kind of interference in future.
Alan Rusbridger, many thanks, editor of Prospect magazine, where you, if you are interested in these matters, and frankly you should be, you'll often get early warnings of events that may be on the horizon, and of course a former editor of The Guardian. Let me read you a quote from the current editor of the Jewish Chronicle. Obviously, it's every newspaper editor's worst nightmare to be deceived by a journalist. The Jewish Chronicle has cut all ties with the freelancer in question, and his work has now been removed from our website. Readers can be assured that stronger internal procedures are being implemented. Meanwhile, Sir Robbie Gibb is still the de facto, I don't know what the correct phrase would be, or still claims to be, as far as I'm aware, the owner of the Jewish Chronicle, and still deigns to advise other BBC journalists on issues of impartiality and even influence editorial policy, up to and including inquiries into the coverage of the situation in the Middle East. I'd remind you, in fact, Jamie reminds me of something that my friend and colleague Lewis Goodall sent to Robbie Gibb after Gibb accused Lewis of impartiality. He replied, "Thanks for that, Robbie. Maybe one day, if I'm as impartial as you, I can get a knighthood too." A reference there to Gibb's role as Director of Communications, I think, for Theresa May. Oh, what a tangled web we weave.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It is 3 minutes after 12. Quite a lot to get through. We're now expecting that sentencing of the disgraced former BBC newsreader Hugh Edwards to be with us at about 12:30. So that will be very much on our watch. I also want to get onto that conversation about state schools being urged to include public speaking in their curricula. This is coming from a teacher at Eton College, and there are two ways into it. The first is he right? To which I think the answer is probably yes. But the second is, how feasible is that in the current state system? And is it a slightly pie-in-the-sky suggestion that could only come from someone a million miles removed from it? So we will get onto that shortly as well. But I felt we could do a little bit more justice to the conversation about the coconut trial, as it has become known. And it's become known as that partly because of the hashtag coined by Nels Abbey, who's a writer and author responsible for Think Like a White Man and the Hip Hop MBA, and a familiar voice in these kind of discussions. And indeed, it was on his social media that I culled some of the inspiration for my thinking in this field. So I'm delighted to see that he rang in during the last news bulletin, and we'll hear from Nels in Camden now. Nels, what do you want to say?
Well, I just wanted to paint the... good morning, James, or good afternoon right now. I must say, this is the first time in my life I've ever called into a radio station. I've appeared on many, but I've never called into one before in my life.
That's how we roll, Nels. That's how we roll.
This is... I must say, I saw this situation from the very beginning, right the way through to the very end. I attended every single hearing there was. So this was surreal, and it should alarm absolutely everybody. That from inception of this situation, it's pretty clear that the placard was, of course, satirical, because what you only see is one side of the placard. On the other side, picture of Suella Braverman's Cruella de Vil.
Right.
Nations. So it was always clear, but it made no sense to anybody who was thinking. Why
just the line went down a little bit there. Why does the Cruella de Vil corollary confirm beyond doubt that it's satirical?
Because it was quite clearly comical from the beginning.
Right.
That it just said Cruella Braverman on the other side, and on the other side.
Well, hang on, because it's not literal either way, is it? I mean, she can't organically be a coconut any more than she can kill Dalmatians to make herself a coat. So
exactly.
Right.
Exactly. But I think we've gone over the placard quite a bit.
Yes.
But what really, the whole thing was alarming, but the court case itself, the 2-day trial, was a television show begging to be made. That, to paint the picture for you, James, the prosecutor was basically a Jacob Rees-Mogg look-alike and sound-alike.
Okay.
And he was there speaking about racial politics that he had no clue about whatsoever. And also, too, it reached a point where one of the expert witnesses actually said to him that you've not done your homework. They couldn't produce a single expert, the state could not produce a single expert witness to speak in their actual favor. But the most shocking thing of all was the fact that everybody knew this was satirical. Everybody knew this was political critique. Any thinking person knew this was political critique. Yet they took it all the way to a trial, to the point where a 9-month pregnant woman had to stand on had to stand in the dock for 2 days straight, sit in the dock for 2 days straight, essentially. And
whose life has been turned upside down, we should add.
Completely destroyed. And she had done, if you meet Maria Hussein, she's one of the loveliest, sweetest and compassionate people you will ever meet. I know her personally. She's a friend of mine now as a result of this.
Well, I'd be quite keen to talk to her, actually. I know you've never rung into a radio station before, but stay on the line when you're finished and speak to Jo about the possibility of us talking to her about what she's been through, if you can, Nels, if you're not too busy. So
absolutely.
Let me read you something from the Times today, and I know you've seen it, because it is from somebody who can't be accused of not knowing about racial politics in the way that the barrister you refer to does. Tomiwa Obalade, who writes in a comment piece today, no amount of sophistry can excuse the fact that this is a racial slur. It is abusing someone based on their race instead of their intelligence or character or any other aspect of their individual personality. You think he's wrong as well?
Of course, but that is the absurd argument that the prosecutor made. So the prosecutor, it's the absurd argument that's made by racists on actual Twitter. It is a brain-dead argument. In fact, it's a non-argument, because when you actually read Tomiwa's article, there is no substantive argument within it. And that's the point. Even the judge said so to the prosecutor, that you are not making an argument. You've not substantiated anything. You're taking, from the beginning, the state, the CPS, wanted the word coconut to be treated as racist. As fact, that was the actual words. We don't want any expert witness, for we believe that it should be treated as a statement of fact that coconut is racist. The state, but thankfully, the judge saw sense and called an expert and allowed expert witness to be permitted. The state, as in the CPS, could not find any expert witnesses. Hence, they were sourcing. I'm not making this up, James.
Go on.
They appeared to be sourcing arguments from Twitter.com. So when you were listening to them in the courtroom, it was like, I've heard these arguments before. Then it dawns on you that these sound like arguments from racists on Twitter,
and these were coming from the mouth of the barrister,
from the mouth
as if they were his own thoughts. So your understanding is that they would have cast their net wide in pursuit of somebody qualified to explain why the word is de facto racist, and they failed to find anybody who could make that case in court.
That is 100% what they did, but they couldn't find anybody who would either A, come to court, or B, say it was racist. They even reached out to Professor Kehinde Andrews to try and get him to say that coconut is racist. Kehinde Andrews, for those listening who don't know, is one of Britain's foremost anti-racist thinkers. Kehinde Andrews himself actually sent them a long, lengthy letter, which I have in my possession, I've seen, where he explained to them that coconut is not racist. It is actually anti-racist. Just to put it in simple terms, coconut did not fall out of a coconut tree. Coconut is a byproduct of the colonial experiences of people, of black and brown people. If you go to the Native Americans, they use the term apple. If you go to the Far East or so, in China and Japan, they use the term apple being red on the outside, white on the inside. In the Far East in Japan or China also, they use the term banana, yellow on the outside, red, white on the inside. In America, they use the term Benedict Arnold. In Britain, we might even use the term Lord Haw-Haw when we're describing our collaborator class or so. So, language best political, at second best, at best political, or at worst political, or at best or worst satirical. It was absurd, and it proved to be absurd. But the state must now be wondering, why did we bother? Why do we put a 9-month woman on trial for what was essentially a satirical placard?
Well, you tell me. How do you? And you can move into the realms of speculation. Obviously, what do you think happened here? How do you? Because you make the point as well that, you know, we were talking about Frank Hester again on Friday, the enormously racist businessman who's given £20 million to the Conservative Party and described wanting to see Diane Abbott shot and how she made him want to hate all black women. And the police are still investigating him, of course, although the wheels have moved noticeably more slowly than they did in the case of Maria Hussein. What do you think actually happened here, Nels? Because your incredulity coupled with your use of the word surrealism suggests that something a little bit extraordinary may have unfolded.
There's many things that may have coincided here. I think on one hand, we have lived...
The phone line is I give you. We'll have one more go at this. Otherwise, the phone line's cutting in and out, and we'll have to call it quits. Go on.
Can you hear me, James?
Yeah, I can, but I don't know how long for.
Okay, so so I think we're experiencing the diversifying of state racism in Britain, right. And there's been a clear effort to ensure that those people who are the principals within that diversification, the Kemi Badenochs, the Suella Bravermans, Rishi Sunak, so on and so forth, that they're almost protected to an extreme degree and can conduct this squalid maneuver, Operation Folly, whatever you wish to call it. But there's other elements that still doesn't make any sense to me. That I stay up at night thinking about. James, we're both writers. It is not normal for a writer to be 85% for a book and then put it to one side to start writing another book. No. I did that this morning at 4 a.m. this morning because I'm so alarmed by this. It doesn't make any sense to me. I'm still trying to figure out, why did they do this? Why did they respond to an anonymous blog based in Washington, D.C. within 6 minutes? Why didn't they listen to their own experts? I even was saying to them up to last week, don't do this. You're going to look silly. So it doesn't make any sense to me.
It is fascinating, and it's also rare for someone to answer a question with that sort of expression of bamboozlement and befuddlement. But I completely understand why. It is impossible. Normally, you exclude the impossible, and whatever you are left with, however improbable, must be the truth. But in this case, it's hard to discern even that. Nels, thank you. Yeah, there's nothing to stop you, of course, getting both books out there in time, says the man who postpones deadlines more violently than possibly anybody else who's ever picked up a pen. 12 minutes after 12 is the time. I want to draw your attention to something else as well now, which is in the arena of public discourse. The front page of the New York Times today reports that Russia secretly worms its way into America's conservative media, and it tells us more about the case we discussed last week regarding a woman called Lauren Chen setting up a company that went on to create the social media outlet called Tenet Media, and the major right-wing, very, very right-wing social media stars who proceeded to post videos that were very sympathetic. Well, they did quite a lot of things, actually. They talked about election fraud. They told lies about COVID-19, about immigrants, and crucially about Russia's war with Ukraine. It subsequently emerged that Tenet Media was funded by Russia. We know that between 2016 and 2020, Russia employed armies of internet trolls, fake accounts and bot farms to try to reach American audiences with debatable success. And quite a few people are wondering about whether or not something similar may have unfolded in Britain, to which I don't know. I find it almost impossible to believe, as did our experts last week, that there wouldn't have been some sort of equivalent British operation. Certainly Brexit seemed to have been influenced heavily by online posting and online propaganda, and everybody knows that instability in the West is great news for the Kremlin. I don't know why. I'm just asking questions, but it did remind me of this encounter between Tucker Carlson, who of course has been considered too much even for Rupert Murdoch's Fox News outlet, and has subsequently found himself popping up in Moscow interviewing. Did he interview Vladimir Putin himself? He's certainly been doing some very he did, didn't he? Yeah, funny that. And I don't know if you recognise the other voice in this clip from a few years ago.
And the left in Europe has so much in common with the left here. They do want conflict with Russia. That's obvious. It's becoming clear in the United States. Why is that? What's the impulse behind that? What about Russia enrages them in a way that, say, North Korea and Iran do not?
Well, they have to have an enemy, don't they? And what Putin represents, of course, for all his faults, but he represents a strong leader who believes in his own nation. They call it nationalism, nationism. They talk about these things in pejorative terms. Of course, Putin doesn't like the European project, because the European project wants to make Ukraine, his next-door neighbour, a member of an alternative political and military alliance. You know, come on, you can't blame him for that.
You can't blame him for that, indeed. I believe that Nigel Farage is coming on Nick Ferrari's show later this week. There's something else you might like to ask him about. It's 12:15.
This is LBC.
Curtains drawn at dawn. You wake, and so does your potential. You don't let it snooze or sit around. You act on it. Run with it. Past the safety of routine and familiarity to somewhere new. Because anything is possible if you choose to make it happen.
Whether you're growing your business, switching careers, or just starting out, make the most of your potential. It all starts with skills. Search Skills for Life.
The thing about hearing difficulties is you can still get the rough gist of most conversations. You know, just about. You might miss some great jokes, like that one, but you'll get the vague idea, and that's okay, isn't it? Not for us, it's not. At Specsavers, we think okay hearing isn't okay. So book a free hearing check with one of our hearing experts today and be part of the conversation. Specsavers. Okay hearing is not okay.
Energy threads through everything we do, from this radio show to your home or your phone, to school halls, to market stalls, to dance floors and the full-time scores, to box set binges, to takeaways, to celebrating birthdays. That's why National Grid is working to deliver the Great Grid Upgrade, the largest overhaul of the electricity grid in generations, connecting more clean, affordable wind power to you and all the things you love to do. The Great Grid Upgrade. Find out more at nationalgrid.com.
Morning. Sign here for your parcel, please.
Thanks. Fancy a cuppa?
I'm fine, actually.
Sure. We've just had a gorgeous kitchen fitted. Midnight blue cupboards, an instant boiling water tap. It won't take long.
From first homes to forever homes, Wix create kitchens you can be really proud of. There are options to suit every budget, with kitchens from under £3,000. Use the Wix free design service and our experts will guide you through the choices. Book your kitchen design appointment today. Feel house proud with Wix.
James O'Brien on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
17 minutes after 12 is the time. State schools must include speaking as crucial life skill, says Eton teacher. It's not the best headline I've ever read, is it? Obviously, people who are non-verbal would balk at that headline in a way, but generally speaking, speaking would be widely regarded as a crucial life skill, wouldn't it? But they don't mean just speaking. they mean sort of public speaking. State schools should set up debating clubs and train teachers in the art of encouraging classroom discussions in order to improve children's oracy. How do you think you spell oracy? If I showed you the word oracy, if I held it up on a card, would you think it was a real word? So I don't know if I've ever mentioned this to you before, but I was actually a national schools public speaking champion in 1988. Stop laughing. And I didn't know oracy was a word. So I was a national champion oracy person. So I know orator and I know oratory, oratory, orator, oratorical, but I never knew oracy. I didn't know oracy was a word. And I guess it does things that the word oratory doesn't do because it doesn't have to be addressing an audience per se. Oracy could include group discussions. So a classroom discussion it means a kind of verbal facility, what we might once have called a way with words, a kiss of the Blarney Stone, the gift of the gab, some of which is natural, some of which is innate, but this teacher would contend some of which can be taught. Private schools have loads of this. You know the distinction between private education and state education is quite blurred because some state schools step up to the plate remarkably in extracurricular areas and funding models and the wherewithal of the PTA and the amount of sharp-elbowed parents who are propelling the school. That you can't make an overall Oh, God, that took me a moment, actually. Sean's been inside. Is that the bloke from the Smiths? Oracy? Yeah? That's really funny, actually. That one drew my attention. No, mate, that's more. Two of you've got. Since when did the listeners to this programme get funnier than I am? That's outrageous behaviour. So you can't make broad, sweeping statements about the difference between private schools and state schools. Of course you can't. But what you can say is that you are much, 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 much more likely to be able to join a debating society at a private school than you are at a state school. And what I don't know, because I haven't really got the experience of it, is how fair it is to suggest that teachers in state schools need advice from a senior leader at Eton College on the importance of encouraging classroom discussions. Teachers might like to respond to that. Is it the case that you need a teacher? Well, I don't know. I don't want to set it up as some sort of quasi-class war. But the idea that I'd never thought of that before. So this chap jumps up and says, have you ever thought about encouraging classroom discussions? I'm from Eton College. And you go, wow, God, no wonder they pay you the big buck. What, you mean that we actually have a conversation in a classroom between the kids in the class? God, whoa, you're a genius. That's one of the whoa. So I don't know. Does he have a point? As a teacher in a state school, or as somebody who recently left a state school, does he actually have a point? Do you look back upon your lessons and think, do you know what, we could have actually had more classroom discussion? Because do you know what I'm doing here? I'm engaging in a form of inverse snobbery. I'm thinking it's bleeding obvious, but maybe I'm being as blind to the reality of it as I'm accusing the other person of being. James, I haven't got time to encourage oracy in my class because I'm too busy trying to keep control, or I'm too busy trying to deal with the kids with special educational needs who have had their SEN assistant axed under austerity. I haven't got that. I'm just trying to get to the bell, mate, without anybody braining a classmate. I haven't got time. Do you see? That's what I mean about nuance. That's what I mean about sweeping generalisations. Some schools will be like that. They are more likely to be state schools, but not all state schools will be like that. And some private schools will also have huge problems with behaviour and disruption. But what I want from you is this. One of the things I learned when I was trying to sort of, well, when I was doing therapy, actually, one of the things I learned was how many of us become welded to our own opinions. There's a story last week I completely got taken over by. I didn't have the time to get it to you, but it's about people who find it impossible to say that they're wrong, like an almost engineered inability, almost like a psychological impossibility of saying that you're wrong. And I used to be like that. I'm far from 100% cured. I'm not sure I ever will be, but I do find it, as you've noticed, a lot easier these days to say that I'm wrong than I used to do. And indeed, I wrote an entire book about it, how not to be wrong, the art of changing your mind, which on reflection should have been called the art of admitting you're wrong, actually. But I just had a bestseller called How to Be Right, so How Not to Be Wrong seemed like a natural progression. It's not the best title. How They Broke Britain is a brilliant title, and it was still in the top 10 yesterday. That's absolutely unbelievable. But enough about me. I don't need any help or advice in understanding why public speaking is a good thing for young people to do, because I did it a lot, and extraordinarily, I did actually manage to turn it into my career. I remember a kid saying, I said to a kid at school, a mate of mine, we were bantering, I'd just won that award that I may not have mentioned to you a moment ago, and I was quite cross that it didn't get as much attention at school as, for example, getting into the county rugby team. And my mate had just got into the county rugby team, and that was like a big poster up in the main hall. And I said, this is ridiculous. That's just I'm a national champion, and you've just got into the county rugby team. And he said, yeah, but you're not exactly going to make a career out of public speaking, are you? And I said, well, I might do. I might become a politician or a priest. I didn't really know about this possible career path. So, if you're listening, Nick, look what I've done. I've made a career out of becoming a public speaker. And the last time I checked, you never played rugby for a living. Although some of the kids we went to school with did, actually, up to and including a former captain of England. So that probably doesn't work either. But I want to know from people who don't have a natural affinity for it. That's what I mean. Or who didn't know they had a natural affinity for it. So this is where the reasons why parents pay large sums of money, which sometimes they can barely afford, to send their children to private school, because the skills that it gives you are sometimes soft skills, sometimes hard skills. It's not just about exam grades. I don't know whether or not I would have discovered how much I love it, and forgive me, how good I am at it, if I hadn't gone to the kind of schools that I went to. So I don't even know that I can use a word like innate. So I was 8 years old when I first stood up in a debating society and made a speech and made some people laugh and had big boys come up to me afterwards and tell me how good it was. And I felt 10 feet tall. I felt like $1 million. I was 8 years old when that happened. Now, if I hadn't gone to that kind of school, and it wasn't even a debating society, it was a school event. It was an annual event where they would have a debate. This house believes, and every single person in the school would attend. And 4 or 6 boys would be on the stage doing the speeches, and everyone in the audience could join in, could put their hand up and do some oracy, as I now know it's called. But what if I hadn't gone to a school like that? I probably still would have been a bit of a pain in the proverbials in class. I still would have been the kid in class trying to make his friends laugh and having the teacher tell him, they're not laughing with you, James, they're laughing at you. That was a recurring theme. I remember thinking, yeah, I'll take that. I can't imagine a stand-up comedian coming off stage to gales of laughter with an audience that's rolling in the aisles, and the promoter takes him to one side and says, they're not laughing with you, you know, they're laughing at you. And you go, yeah, that's fine by me. That's absolutely fine by me. But teachers at the time seemed to think that it would give you pause or make you stop being a pain in the proverbials in class. So 8 years old, and it's not class size, Chris, because there were 140 kids in that gym. I remember it, actually. It was a seminal moment for me. There was 140 kids in that. So, class size will have a lot to do with classroom discussions. But a school-wide debate, 140 kids sitting in the gym, sitting cross-legged on the floor in the gym with a couple of lads up on the stage, doing speeches, and then we could put our hands in the air and say stuff. And I did. And I thought, wow, I'm good at this. What if I hadn't gone to that kind of school? Would I ever have had that moment? Be the sort of class clown or the attention seeker? Would I ever have had that moment if I hadn't gone to that? I don't know. Yeah, 2 years later, I'm on the stage giving the speeches. Year after that, I win the debating cup. Get to my next school, join the debating society straight away, get stuck in immediately. End up, I don't know whether I mentioned this, being a national schools public speaking champion at the age of 16. But if I hadn't gone to a school when I was 8... that had a debate that everyone could contribute to, and I hadn't discovered not just a facility for it, but a real love of it, a love of it. That moment when you feel you've got a room in the palm of your hand. I get it a little bit these days at book festivals. I don't get it here because I can't see you. You might have just turned me off. You might be flossing your teeth or something. You could be in the bath. You might be on the toilet. I don't know what you're doing while I talk to you. It's not the same as addressing an audience. It's a completely different dynamic. I talked to Tony Blackburn about this a bit on Full Disclosure a couple of weeks ago. We would not do any other job in the world, Tony Blackburn and I, than the jobs that we have. There's something about radio that speaks to almost every fibre of my being. I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. But being in front of an audience just it reaches one tiny part that nothing else can quite reach. And I discovered at the age of 8 that I loved it. So I want to know whether or not it's something that you can appreciate the benefits of, even if you weren't immediately good at it. Do you see what I mean? If it's something that can be encouraged or taught, and I want to know what flourishes inside you. So one of my oh man, I shouldn't have done that because I'm not going to, because the friend that I lost during lockdown, I get a bit emotional whenever I think about him, and he hijacks me like that. Do you get that with friends that you've lost sometimes, where you're just merrily tootling along on a completely different subject and you remember your mate, or even, I suppose, a family member, and it feels like you've just been hit over the back of the head with a cosh, and you go, But he hated it. Absolutely hated it. He showed me once that his palms sweated. I thought that was a figure of speech. He said, look, mate, he said, my palms are sweating. And he had to go and deliver even his own speech at his own wedding, I think it was. Absolutely. And he nailed it. He learned. he ended up running quite a big important company, and he had to give, big speeches to rooms full of tech bros and media people, and he smashed it. He did one with Jack Whitehall, and Jack Whitehall came on the stage and said, wow, how do I follow that? And that was my mate who left comprehensive school in Rochdale and broke out in hives at the thought of public speaking. So he could learn, something got piqued, something got pricked, provoked inside him by it. So how do you put that into words? How do you describe that? What does public speaking give to people who are not necessarily, it's taken me 20 minutes to get there, but I know what the word I'm looking for is, who are not by nature show-offs? I am a show-off. I'm quite introverted outside work, but obviously I'm a show-off. If you're not a show-off, what does public speaking give you? 0345 6060 973, and can they do it in a school? Can they give it to you in a school? Because I think they probably can, but I'm coming from it from a very, very personal and specific perspective.
This is LBC with James O'Brien. Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
12:34 is the time. So if you're not a show-off, what does public speaking do for you? And how feasible is it that teachers in state schools can, as a team leader, a leader at Eton College is suggesting, can do more to get their own children to do it? Just a little shout out to Scott, who is obviously also someone who misses the great friend that I referred to a moment ago, because you've name checked him in a message that I bet you didn't think I'd see, but it snuck through. So thank you, mate. Stay safe. Will's in Kensal Rise. Will, what made you pick up the phone?
I just thought it's broader than just about. Well, it's such a broad topic, I think, public speaking. It's not just about, whether it's useful for so many things in life, so many roles require it, and if you don't have that capability, there's a lot of things that you wouldn't feel.
But can you learn it?
I think you can. Yes, you can definitely learn it. There's skills there, but whether or not you can then deal with, I think some people have anxiety as well about public speaking, and that's probably a separate thing. But I also think it's about validation as well. Like a lot of things in school about sort of facts, learning facts, that's this, that's right, that's not right. Whereas learning to debate and public speak is about sort of giving them a sense that you're allowed to have an opinion. Your opinion matters. About how to listen to each other.
I'd never thought of that, actually. Validity. Yeah. It's not for the likes of me. It's the opposite of that, isn't it? My voice deserves to be heard. Yeah, I think so. It's so much of life is about communicating and hearing others and being heard yourself, and it's a way of, I think, people learning how to become themselves as well, rather than just being sort of fact automatons. And that certainly, used to be a way of where schools and the educational process used to be for quite a lot of people. What's your story?
About learning facts. My story, I went to a school where there was a debating club, but I didn't think it was very interesting or useful. It was sort of done by what I thought were sort of geeks, and I didn't see the value of it.
Yeah, all right, mate.
But later in life, I've sort of come to realise that it's really hugely important and valuable. Yes. I find it difficult. I mean, I find one of the reasons why I sometimes phone in these programmes, because it's a bit of a test for me, actually, to be able to sort of speak in public. I had a go at doing stand-up. I did a couple of courses in stand-up comedy a couple of times, partly as a way of getting the experience of being up on a stage and public speaking in a slightly
because you know implicitly that it is a good thing to be able to do, and if it doesn't come naturally, it's worth putting a shift in and trying to get good at it.
Absolutely, and and if you've got any role, sales is all about communication, isn't it? And being heard. You need it in everything, and any sort of senior level role requires being able to communicate, and also in front of people.
Well, you'd think so.
Audiences. Yeah, I'd have thought so.
You'd think so, but it doesn't always pan out like that. Thank you, Will. That is a really powerful point. And that's what I meant by not being a show-off. Because if you're a show-off, you think, oh, this is great. Look, audience. You're like a kind of cartoon character. Audience, speak, spotlight, me. And it never crosses your mind that your voice doesn't deserve to be heard. Could you imagine trying to do this job if you didn't think that your voice deserved to be heard? But that's not normal. I am abnormal. It's probably my mum's fault. That the lesson that somebody learns in class, if they're encouraged to speak in class when they wouldn't normally do so, and as they speak, they see light bulbs igniting above people's heads, they see pennies dropping from the ceiling of the classroom, and they feel bigger, better, validated, vindicated. They feel seen. I'm going to defend myself from Sarah's accusation. Sarah, I think, describe the difference between oracy and oratory at the beginning of this, but you go further, so I shall read out what you add. Oracy is not about the art of public speaking within schools. It's about arming all pupils with the ability to express themselves, to advocate for themselves, and to actively listen. What's that? Oracy is as much about listening to others as it is about articulating your own thoughts. There is an increasingly strong focus on oracy in primary schools, which is vital when it comes to levelling out the playing field for all pupils, particularly those who may be second language speakers. Oracy focuses on teaching the art of conversation, keeping eye contact, asking questions, inviting others into discussion. These skills are particularly vital for the children of the COVID generation. So, ironically enough, Sarah tells us they're teaching this in state primary schools, whereas some of the most prominent products of Eton College, perhaps, would benefit from precisely the skills that she's describing. Keeping eye contact, asking questions, inviting others into the discussion, as opposed to just sort of arrogantly riding roughshod over all concerns and quibbles. 12:39 is the time. Matthew's in Camberwell. Matthew, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, very welcome.
I'm a state school educated person who's I've always really struggled with public speaking and that type of thing. It's honestly, it's been quite difficult for me to even ring into this. I'm
fair enough.
Quite a difficult thing for me to do. But it's something, this is something I've listened to your show quite a lot, and this is something I feel really sort of passionately about. So went to a really poorly performing state school, sort of worked my way through that, never did any sort of public speaking, debating, anything like that.
Could you have done? Was the option there, or was it just, that's what I thought.
The option was never there, but I mean, you talk about, it's not just about the schools putting it in place, it's about the whole sort of nature of state schools, or at least the one I went to. I mean, it was very like dog eat dog, and it was like, if anyone, you had to stay like away from the spotlight in order to get through, basically. It's like, like if you wanted to avoid getting picked on or like debating.
I'm a public speaker, don't you know? Come and watch my speeches.
Exactly what it is. You want to avoid that at all costs, but
what you're saying very politely is I'd have got my head kicked in on a daily basis, Matthew.
Well, no, but the thing is, like, all of this stuff seems important at that age. And now I'm 27 now. I've made my way, through A levels, uni. Yeah. I'm a commercial solicitor in London now, but it's still not having the public speaking back, all of that stuff. It always affects me because I do quite a lot of public speaking in my job, and I find it really difficult. Like even on calls or meetings with 2-3 people, it's something I really have to sort of struggle through. And I'm not saying state schools shouldn't do that. It absolutely should be something that they're doing, but it's not as simple as state schools putting debating classes and into place.
But the earlier you do it, and that's why Sarah's comments about oracy, so it doesn't have to be a debating society. They could have just been more discussion in class, more encouragement to make eye contact. A school like mine, oddly, produces people who are just as unnerved by it as you are, but what we get taught is how to hide it really, really well. That's often what was described by a government minister a few years ago as public school swagger, is actually hiding it. When I'm, on rare occasions, someone's foolish enough to ask me to give advice to the younger generation, I always tell them everybody else is as frightened as you are. Except the sociopaths. They're the only ones that aren't frightened. But do you find it's getting better as time passes?
It is, but I do agree it's so much harder. If I'd started earlier, it would be so much easier. And you don't realise. I didn't realise until I went to university because I studied law there, and obviously everyone's debating and mooting and all that kind of stuff. And I physically couldn't get involved with it. I just found it too stressful, too difficult, and
I can well imagine
really
that.
Sort of, I wanted to be a barrister originally. Obviously, that dream pretty quickly went out the window, and I realised I just physically couldn't do it.
Well, you're not a show-off. You're not a show-off by nature.
No. I don't. I don't.
I think most barristers are probably show-offs. The best barristers are probably.
I work with a lot of barristers, so I won't comment on that.
That's a massive yes from Matthew. But that's not a bad thing. In some ways, it's a good thing not to be a show-off. But that facility to do it. I wish you could meet my mate who passed away, because he went on a journey very similar to the one you describe, and he ended up smashing it. By the time he was in his 40s, he could stand up in front of anybody
Yeah,
and
that's the aim for me, really. I just try to get there, but it's difficult.
You will, mate. Seriously.
Thank you.
Absolutely. 12:43 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'm going to take this at face value. I've got no reason to doubt that it is true. But you remember a moment ago when I said I had no idea what you might be doing while I'm talking to you. It's very different to having an audience in front of you. I was in front of a lovely audience in Chiswick on Saturday night, and the dynamic is different. I said, you could be flossing your teeth. Well, Sean got in touch to say, wow, I was honestly just flossing my teeth while listening to you. And this, I didn't mention this, Paul, so I've got no idea why you decided to share. Paul says, I was attempting to clip my toenails while listening to you. I don't know that we should open this. It feels a bit like a Pandora's box, doesn't it? What are you doing while listening to me today? I'm not sure I want to know. I think we've probably peaked, haven't we, with flossing your teeth and clipping your toenails. Anything more intimate than that, I don't want to know, seriously. But what I do want to know is, I'll tell you what, let's take Matthew as a starting point there. And discovering a real facility for it quite late in life because nobody gave the opportunity to discover it earlier. I wonder what that's like.
Leading Britain's conversation, LBC, with James O'Brien.
It's 12:47, and of course you can inculcate the opposite in a child when they're at school. You can create whatever the opposite is of oracy skills. This is very moving, actually, from Mike. I hope you're still listening, Mike. I get paralysed by speaking in public, James, where I can't breathe and I lose control. I was scared of teachers at school who could hit you at any moment without any provocation, and bullies that would jump you for being a swat if you spoke out loud in lessons. I'm sure it's held me back in my career. I'm 53 now and I still get very nervous even answering the phone in an open plan office. I hate the way I am and I could never ring in even though I wish that I could. Oh man. Mike, if you ever do ring in, I promise you that we'll have a good chat, yeah? I promise you that no one will jump you or hit you or hurt you metaphorically or obviously physically, but I'd consider that such an achievement if one day you did feel comfortable enough to ring in, and I really hope that you do. On a slightly less serious note, thank you. I should have known. Everybody's getting in touch to tell me about the slightly unexpected things they're doing while listening to the programme. It's strange how many dentists I'm on in. Why do you have me on in the dentist? Take your mind off having a tooth extract. I've got 2 people having teeth extracted and 3 people telling me I'm on in the dentist. In the waiting room or in the actual surgery? I know dentists have me on in the surgery, actually, because if you do, it's a bit like driving. You need a little bit more sustenance, intellectual sustenance, something to chew on, rather more than just music. James says, I was dyeing my beard, James, but I was paying full attention, I promise. I'm knitting a blanket for my 4th great-grandchild while listening to you, says Christina. That'll do. I run a little coffee shop in Cornwall. I close the shop on my own on many days, and staff, I presume you mean you are... Oh, I see what you mean. And you're part of my closing team, James. I listen to you on catch-up while baking, cooking and cleaning. Thank you for being part of my closing team. Liz, you are more than well... Isn't this lovely? Another dentist. This is unbelievable. And I can't tell you what I'm doing, says Topo. No, not that. Seriously, calm down. Honestly, how old are you? I can't tell you what I'm doing, other than to say it involves, oh Lord, a sample for a pathology investigation. Oh, thank goodness we're nearly done for the day. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to maintain my focus between now and 1 o'clock. Back to the question of public speaking. Dallas is in Poros in Greece. Dallas, what would you like to say?
Just interesting hearing so many comments about the fear out there about public speaking, and I've trained almost 24,000 people now, and
that's nothing.
But I've definitely, particularly with the teenagers and the school students, since the pandemic, have seen a real growth in anxiety around this. And some of the schools are doing fabulous jobs of training their schools in oracy, but it's sad to see sometimes that students are given a choice of do they get up or not. When you go to a maths class, perhaps you are expected to do maths. And I would really advise in terms of oracy with the schools of not giving the kids so much of a choice in it.
You've got to do it. Well, yeah, but then you've got people like Mike. Did you hear Mike's message that I rang out? He's 53 and he still breaks out in genuine cold sweats and the shakes when he's presented.
completely understand, and that's why the younger you are trying to get through this one. I had a young boy, about 9 months ago, when it got to his turn to learn this, he said no, not going to do it. He literally was shaking, and this went on and on. We went out in the hallway. We finally got him up to do just probably answer a couple of questions, and then a couple of hours later he came up for a public speaking game, and he answered a couple. And in this particular school, they train all the year 9s and some of the confident year 7s and 8s. At the end of the day, all the students in that particular class, about 32 of them, were offered the opportunity to do more volunteers only. And I was incredibly surprised to see this young lad put his hand up. And he went on to advanced training, he went on to junior masters, he went on to masters. That was a Tuesday afternoon when he was shaking. On the Friday afternoon, he got up and did a speech in front of 200 others.
Oh, man.
Without notes.
It makes you wonder what would have happened to Mike if someone had taken him in hand when he was at school. So you're a bit like you sound a bit like one of those singing teachers who says that everyone can sing.
I honestly believe that the cruelty is allowing these kids to think they can't do it.
Yeah.
But let me just finish that story for one moment.
Okay.
When I interviewed him on that stage, I said, why? Why did you put yourself through that?
Yeah.
And he said, from the age of 7, I've had crippling anxiety, and I no longer want to stay hostage to that.
Fair enough. And I mean, that's an extreme example, but between the two, the inveterate show-off like me and the lad with crippling anxiety like him, all human life sits between those two posts probably, and there's not a single person who wouldn't benefit from oracy. Final question, Dallas. When did you come across the word oracy? Have you always known this word oracy, or is it?
No.
No, it's quite a recent development, isn't it?
Yeah, the last couple of years.
Yeah,
more.
I like it.
Yeah.
Do not be the person who resists the stuff that wasn't around when you were young, because it makes you feel old or it makes you feel judged or whatever it may. It's great to introduce things that are new. Oracy, not oratory. Oratory's easy. Well, I find oratory easy, and actually, to be fair, Dallas is talking about oratory. But oracy would be conversational skills, eye contact, all of that stuff, the listening as well. You can do it in this job, actually. You listen out next time someone is interviewing a famous person, well, most obviously perhaps a politician, and listen to the second and third questions and see how framed they have been by the answer to the first one. Because if you've got a list of questions on the sheet of paper in front of you, you are not, if you stick to it religiously, you're not going to conduct as good an interview as you might do if you are ready to move according to the answer that you get to the first question. This won't always be true. Some people provide really self-contained, neat answers, and you move on to an entirely new subject. But the most interesting conversations to listen to are the ones that go off in unexpected directions, and that means that the interrogator, the questioner, has to be prepared to follow. It really sounds like a statement of the bleeding obvious, but you listen out. You won't catch anyone bad at that on this radio station, but listen to other radio stations. Well, will you? I don't know. I can't think of anyone off the top of my head. But listen to other radio stations and you'll hear it, or TV stations, and you'll see people who have probably got a list of questions in front of them written by somebody else, like a producer. And in answer to the first question, you could say, well, of course, I'm a very successful secret serial killer. And then the second question will be, and what's your favourite colour? I exaggerate slightly, but that's oracy, I guess, of a sort. Thank you, Dallas. Jester is in Preston. That was close. It was close to a perfect rhyme, that, Jester. What would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
I've never called you before.
Welcome.
This is my sister, who's probably listening, will be absolutely flabbergasted.
Do you want to say hello? Give her a shout.
Hello, Elaine in Germany.
Hello, Elaine in Germany. Go on, what do you want to say, Jester?
Well, what are you talking about, doing speeches? I'd love to be able to speak and stand up in people and speak without getting really anxious. And to perhaps do little performances in plays and things like that. And
yes.
I'd love to do it because I'm an introvert, but I'm also got a tiny little bit of what you've got, but only a tiny bit.
Yeah.
Well, I'm brave and I will do things. I only, my experience of school echoes what that guy said earlier.
Yeah.
I was assaulted by a teacher at school for losing a place in a group reading.
Right.
and he called me to the front, and he belted me so hard round the ear that I went flying across the classroom floor, and that probably resulted in my anxiety that I've still got.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds... Go on, carry on.
Well, yes, and I've listened to you before, and I know you're very empathic, and you've had private education, which. But what strikes me about you is that you understand people like me, and
thank you.
Even despite your because of your private education, I think it's lovely the way you talk about people.
Beautiful compliment. Thank you, Jester. I shall try to live up to that. It's probably down to my mum as much as anything else, actually. But and I'm not going to patronise you, but you know the idea of working your way through it. The more you do it. Aversion therapy, I suppose, is one of the technical terms. The more you do it, the easier it gets. But as you say, I'm glad I'm not the person who thinks that because it's easy for me, it's easy for everybody. I know that it isn't, and if I didn't before today, then I would do now. Take care, mate. And love to Elaine in Germany. Last word on this to Ross, who's in Weston-super-Mare. Ross, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
I want to mention the kind of relevance of public speaking to formal interview processes.
Oh, yes.
So when you read an article like that, a lot of people, probably myself included, think, barring the odd wedding speech, is it relevant? But I've got a lot of friends that I've taken through. I'm quite happy speaking in public.
Yeah.
And I've taken them through, and with that process, I was converting their experience into that kind of standardised interview matrix. And if people like myself from working class backgrounds, if you don't have the ability to, like you said, to convey in a way that is, in an effective way, you run the risk of missing out on jobs, even though you could be completely qualified.
And I think the opposite is true, mate. I think people who can talk the talk like I can end up getting promoted into positions they've got no business getting anywhere near, especially in politics.
I've had it where I'm very lucky. I'm very comfortable in interviews. I'm happy to, like you said, have the questions bounce back. I'm confident in my ability to kind of convey what I can bring to it. And I've sat down with maybe 5-6 of my friends that have got all the skills in the world, all the experience. But unless you fit it around that formalised interview process, as you said, potentially, depending on where you went to school and your public speaking experience,
and it shouldn't be like
that.
Miss out. And it shouldn't, and it is something that's doable everywhere, but resources and sundry other issues depending. Ross, thank you. You've taken us right up to the wire. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you'll also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as all of Global's live radio stations. So download Global Player for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com.
Leading Britain's conversation. LBC.